This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was driving back from a work conference, eager to get home after a long week away. The sun was setting as I cruised down the lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but open fields and the occasional stand of trees. I had the radio on low, humming along absently to some old 80s tune. That's when I first noticed something was wrong with my car. There was a slight shuddering, barely perceptible at first. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination. But over the next few miles, the shaking got worse. The engine started to sputter and lose power. My heart sank as I realized I was in trouble. I managed to pull over onto the narrow shoulder, just as the engine died completely. For a moment, I sat there in stunned silence. Then I grabbed my phone, praying I had signal. No such luck. Not a single bar. Of course. I popped the hood and got out to take a look, though I knew next to nothing about cars. The fading light made it hard to see much. I fiddled uselessly with a few wires and hoses, hoping against hope that I'd magically fix whatever was wrong. After a few minutes, I gave up and slammed the hood in frustration. That's when it really hit me how utterly alone I was out here. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving just a faint glow in the west. There were no streetlights, no houses or buildings in sight. Just empty fields stretching into the gathering darkness. I hadn't seen another car pass by since I'd broken down. I got back in the car, locking the doors. I tried the engine again, but it was completely dead. My options were limited. I could try to flag down a passing car, but traffic seemed non-existent on this road. Walking to find help seemed risky. I had no idea how far the nearest town might be. I decided to wait it out until morning. Surely some cars would come by eventually, right? I had some snacks and water. I'd be uncomfortable, but I could manage for one night. I texted my roommate to let her know the situation, hoping the message would go through once I had signal again. As full darkness settled in, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The silence was oppressive. No traffic noise, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the faint rustle of wind through the grass. I kept peering out the windows, straining to see anything in the pitch black beyond the car. After an hour or so, my eyes had adjusted enough to make out vague shapes in the moonlight. The empty field beside the road, the line of trees in the distance. As I stared out into the night, I started to imagine movement in the shadows, a darker patch of black that seemed to shift and flow. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just my eyes playing tricks. But the sense of being watched grew stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the darkness, observing me. I rolled up the windows and double-checked that the doors were locked. I tried to distract myself by listening to the radio, but got nothing but static. I flipped through my phone, looking at old photos and messages, anything to keep my mind occupied. But my eyes kept being drawn back to the windows, searching the night. A few hours passed like this, with my paranoia steadily increasing. I was starting to feel claustrophobic in the car, but too scared to get out. My breath was coming faster, my palms sweaty on the steering wheel. That's when I heard it. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. It was coming from behind the car. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The steps were slow, deliberate. They paused for a moment, then continued, moving around to the passenger side. I stayed perfectly still, eyes locked on the passenger window. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For several long moments, there was only silence. Then 3 sharp knocks on the window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. A strangled yelp escaped my throat. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I swung it towards the passenger window. For a split second, I saw a face pressed against the glass. Pale, gaunt features, dark, sunken eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. A mouth stretched in an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. I screamed and dropped the phone, plunging the car back into darkness. I scrambled to find it, my hands shaking violently. When I finally got the light back on and pointed it at the window, there was nothing there. I swept the beam around the car, searching frantically for any sign of the figure. But there was no movement, no sound, just the empty night beyond the windows. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the phone, its harsh light my only defense against the darkness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real. I must have dozed off and had a nightmare, or my frightened brain had conjured up an illusion. But I couldn't shake the bone-deep terror I'd felt in that moment. The absolute certainty that something inhuman had been right outside my car, separated from me by only a thin pane of glass. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the sky, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever had happened in the night, surely I was safe now. I watched the sun slowly rise, feeling some of the paralyzing fear melt away. Once it was fully light out, I decided to try starting the car one more time before attempting to flag someone down. To my utter shock, the engine turned over immediately. It purred to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I didn't question this miraculous recovery. I threw the car into drive and peeled out onto the highway, my tires squealing. I drove well over the speed limit all the way home, my hands clenched white-knuckled on the wheel. It's been weeks now, and I still can't explain what happened that night. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a combination of exhaustion, fear, and an overactive imagination. But late at night, when I'm alone, I can still see those glowing eyes and that terrible grin. I find myself obsessively checking and rechecking that my doors and windows are locked. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That one night stranded on a lonely highway changed me forever. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear footsteps approaching my bed, and in my nightmares, I hear those 3 sharp knocks over and over again. The day started out perfect. Clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, and the promise of adventure on a new trail I'd been wanting to check out. I packed light, just bringing some water, trail mix, and my phone. In hindsight, I should have been way more prepared, but I figured it was just a day hike. How wrong I was. About an hour into the hike, I came across a little unmarked path branching off from the main trail. It looked intriguing, winding through a particularly lush and dense part of the forest. On impulse, I decided to explore it, thinking I'd only venture a short way before turning back. That split-second choice would prove to be a massive mistake. The path quickly became overgrown and hard to follow. Before I knew it, I'd lost sight of where I'd come from. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same, just endless trees and undergrowth in every direction. A knot of anxiety started to form in my stomach as I realized I had no idea where I was. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use GPS to navigate back to the trail. To my horror, there was no signal, not even one bar. Panic started to set in as the reality of my situation hit me. I was lost in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help or find my way out. For what felt like hours, I stumbled through the forest, trying to find anything familiar. But the trees just seemed to close in around me, getting denser and darker. The quiet was eerie. No bird sounds, no rustling animals, just the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. As the day wore on, exhaustion and dehydration started to take their toll. My water was running low, and I had no idea how to find a safe source to refill. The forest floor was damp and treacherous, causing me to slip and fall multiple times. My clothes were torn and muddy, and I was covered in scratches from thorny bushes. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard voices in the distance. At first I was elated. Other people meant help, right? But as the voices got closer, my blood ran cold. These weren't the sounds of friendly hikers or park rangers. The tones were harsh and angry, punctuated by the metallic clicks of what could only be weapons being readied. I crouched behind a large tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. Through the foliage, I caught glimpses of a group of men. They were dressed in ragged, dirty clothes and carried an assortment of guns and crude weapons. My mind raced. Were they some kind of militia? Survivalists? Criminals hiding out in the woods? Whatever they were, they looked dangerous and definitely not happy about an intruder in their territory. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. I held my breath, praying they'd pass by without noticing me. But luck wasn't on my side. A twig snapped under my foot, and their heads whipped around in my direction. "Hey, who's there?" one of them shouted. "Come out now, or we'll start shooting." I was frozen in terror. If I ran, they'd surely catch me. If I revealed myself, who knows what they'd do. I was completely at their mercy. Trembling, I slowly stood up, hands raised. "Please don't hurt me," I stammered. "I'm lost. I didn't mean to trespass." The men surrounded me, their weapons trained on my chest. The apparent leader, a grizzled man with a wild beard, stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here," he growled. "This is our land. We don't take kindly to outsiders." I tried to explain that I was just a hiker who'd gotten lost, but they weren't interested in my excuses. They started arguing amongst themselves about what to do with me. Some wanted to just chase me off. Others had more sinister intentions. I stood there shaking, certain I was about to die alone in these God-forsaken woods. Just as the situation was about to boil over, we heard the sound of engines approaching. The men's faces paled. "Rangers!" one of them hissed. In an instant they melted back into the forest, leaving me standing there alone and confused. Moments later, 2 park ranger vehicles burst into the clearing. I've never been so relieved to see anyone in my life. I broke down in tears as they rushed to my aid, checking me for injuries and giving me water. As it turns out, my family had reported me missing when I didn't return on time. The rangers had been searching the area for hours. They were shocked to find me so far off the marked trails, in a part of the forest known to harbor dangerous individuals. The ride back to civilization was a blur. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and in shock from my ordeal. The rangers explained that there had been increasing problems with squatters and criminals using the remote parts of the forest as hideouts. They'd been trying to clear them out, but it was a vast area to cover. It's been months since that day, but I still have nightmares about being lost in those woods, surrounded by hostile strangers. I've replayed the events over and over, thinking about how differently things could have ended if the rangers hadn't shown up when they did. The experience has completely changed how I approach hiking and outdoor activities. I never go out without a fully charged phone, portable charger, paper map, compass, and emergency supplies. even for short trips. And I absolutely do not stray from marked trails, no matter how tempting an unexplored path might look. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Nature can be beautiful, but it can also be incredibly dangerous if you're not prepared. One wrong turn, one moment of overconfidence, and you can find yourself in a life-threatening situation. Always respect the wilderness, follow the rules, and never underestimate the importance of proper preparation. I'm eternally grateful to those park rangers for saving my life that day. But I know I'm one of the lucky ones. Not everyone who gets lost in those woods makes it out alive. So please, learn from my mistake. Stick to the trails, tell someone where you're going, and always be prepared for the worst. You never know when a simple hike might turn into a fight for survival. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on what was supposed to be a challenging but rewarding day hike through a remote section of national forest. The trail was overgrown and clearly hadn't seen much foot traffic in years, which only added to my excitement. I loved the feeling of discovering hidden places that few others had seen. As I made my way deeper into the dense woods, the canopy of trees grew thicker, casting the forest floor into an eerie twilight. The usual forest sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, scurrying critters, seemed muffled and distant. An unsettling quiet settled over everything. That's when I first spotted it through a gap in the trees, the weathered gray boards of what looked like an old cabin. My curiosity was instantly piqued. I knew these woods were expansive, but I hadn't expected to find any structures out here. Surely it must have been abandoned long ago. As I approached, I could see just how dilapidated the cabin was. The roof was partially caved in, windows were smashed out, and vines crept up the walls. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. Still, something about it sent a chill down my spine. Every instinct told me to turn back, but my curiosity won out. The wooden porch creaked ominously under my feet as I made my way to the front door, which hung crookedly on rusted hinges. I had to squeeze through the partially open doorway, my backpack scraping against the rotting wood. The cabin's interior was dark and musty. Weak beams of sunlight filtered through holes in the roof and cracks between the wall boards, illuminating swirling dust motes. As my eyes adjusted, I began to make out the cabin's sparse furnishings, a rusty iron bed frame, a rotting wooden table, some broken chairs. Everything was coated in a thick layer of grime. That's when I noticed the first truly unsettling detail: dark reddish-brown stains on the torn mattress lying askew on the bed frame. With growing dread, I realized they were unmistakably old bloodstains. My heart began to race as I wondered what violent acts had occurred here. Against my better judgment, I continued exploring the cabin's single room. In one corner, I found a stack of old Polaroid photos scattered on the floor. With trembling hands, I picked one up, then immediately wished I hadn't. The image showed a young woman bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. I flipped through more photos, each one more disturbing than the last. Men and women in various states of captivity and torture. I dropped the photos and stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What kind of monster had lived here? How many innocent people had suffered and died in this God-forsaken place? That's when I felt it, an oppressive, malevolent presence settling over the cabin. The air grew thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I became absolutely certain I was no longer alone. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadowy corner behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but could see nothing in the gloom. Another growl, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Panic exploded in my chest. I bolted for the door, no longer caring about squeezing through carefully. I slammed into the rotting wood with my full weight, splintering it open. As I tumbled onto the porch, I heard an inhuman roar of rage from inside the cabin. I scrambled to my feet and took off running as fast as my legs would carry me. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, not even trying to find the trail. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that nightmarish place as possible. I ran until my lungs were on fire and my legs felt like jelly. Only then did I dare to stop and look back. The woods were silent once more. Whatever had been in that cabin didn't seem to have pursued me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of malevolent eyes watching me from the shadows. Shaking and on the verge of tears, I managed to find my way back to the main trail and practically sprinted back to my car. I peeled out of the trailhead parking lot, not even bothering to change out of my muddy hiking clothes. It's been months since that day, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every time I close my eyes, I see those horrifying photographs. I hear that inhuman growl. I feel that evil presence settling over me. I've tried to research the history of those woods to see if there are any records of an old cabin or of people going missing in the area. But I've found nothing concrete. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. If the isolation and creepy atmosphere caused my mind to conjure up those terrifying visions. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Something unspeakably evil happened in that cabin, and whatever dark force still lingers there, I fear it isn't finished. I can only hope that no other unsuspecting hikers stumble upon that place of nightmares. As for me, I don't think I'll ever set foot in those woods again. I was on a solo road trip through the Midwest, driving for hours on lonely highways surrounded by endless cornfields. As the sun began to set, I realized I was running dangerously low on gas. I hadn't seen any signs of civilization for miles, and my GPS showed nothing nearby. Just as I was starting to panic, I spotted a small, dilapidated gas station up ahead. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the gravel lot. The place looked ancient and run down, with faded paint peeling off the wooden siding. A flickering neon open sign glowed weakly in the growing twilight. It wasn't exactly inviting, but I was desperate. As I got out to pump gas, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off. The air was eerily still, without even the chirping of crickets or rustling of cornstalks. I tried to shake off my unease as I inserted my credit card, but the card reader just blinked, "Error." Great. I reluctantly headed inside to pay cash, a little bell tinkling as I pushed open the creaky door. The interior was dimly lit and musty. Shelves of dusty snacks and automotive supplies lined the walls. Behind the counter stood a gaunt old man with wild white hair, staring at me with piercing blue eyes. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. "Pump number 2, please." The old man didn't move, just kept staring. After an uncomfortable pause, he spoke in a raspy voice. "You shouldn't be here, stranger." A chill ran down my spine. "Excuse me?" "This ain't no place for outsiders after dark," he continued. "There's a curse on this land. Evil things roam these parts at night." I forced a nervous laugh. "Right. Look, I just need some gas and I'll be on my way." The old man shook his head solemnly. "It may already be too late. They know you're here now." Before I could respond, the bell above the door jangled. I turned to see three large, rough-looking men enter the store. They were dressed in grimy work clothes and had a menacing air about them. The leader, a hulking guy with a shaved head, locked eyes with me and grinned maliciously. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we got ourselves a city boy." His companions chuckled darkly. I felt my heart rate spike. These guys clearly meant trouble. I stammered out, "I don't want any problems. I'm just passing through." "Oh, you got problems all right," the leader sneered, cracking his knuckles. "Nobody passes through our territory without paying the toll." I glanced desperately at the old cashier, but he just stood there impassively. The three men started to spread out, blocking my path to the exit. I backed away, hands raised. "Look, I'll give you whatever cash I have. Just let me leave." The leader laughed. "Oh, we'll take your cash, but that ain't going to be enough." He pulled out a wicked-looking hunting knife. "We're going to have some fun with you first." Panic seized me. I looked around frantically for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself, but I was trapped and outnumbered. Suddenly, the old cashier's voice rang out. "Run, boy! Out the back! Now!" Without hesitation, I bolted for the door behind the counter. I heard angry shouts and pounding footsteps behind me as I burst through into a dark hallway. There was another door at the end, moonlight shining through its window. I sprinted towards it, heart pounding. Just as I reached for the handle, I felt a hand grab the back of my shirt. I spun around to see the leader, his face contorted with rage. He swung the knife at me and I jerked back, feeling it slice across my arm. Ignoring the pain, I lashed out with a desperate punch that caught him in the jaw. He staggered back, and I used the moment to wrench open the door and stumble outside. I found myself in an overgrown field behind the station. I could hear shouting from inside as I ran blindly through the tall grass. My lungs burned and my cut arm throbbed, but terror kept me going. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking violently. Just as I got the door open, I heard an engine roar to life nearby. Headlights suddenly illuminated me, and I saw a battered pickup truck speeding across the lot towards me. I dove into my car and jammed the key in the ignition, praying it would start. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. I slammed it in reverse and stomped on the gas, tires squealing as I fishtailed onto the highway. In my rearview mirror, I saw the truck barreling after me, gaining ground quickly. I pushed my old sedan to its limits, the speedometer creeping past 90, then 100. The truck was still there, but slowly falling behind. After several miles of terrified driving, I finally lost sight of my pursuers. But I didn't slow down or relax until I saw lights up ahead, a real gas station, bustling with normal travelers. As I pulled in, the adrenaline started to wear off. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely put the car in park. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like a nightmare, but the gash on my arm proved it was all too real. I never reported the incident to the police. Who would believe such a wild story? I tried to convince myself it was just some local thugs preying on travelers. But in the years since, I've never been able to fully shake the old man's words about curses and evil things. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those malevolent grins and that run-down gas station glowing in the twilight. I'll never know for sure what I stumbled into that night, but one thing's for certain. I'll never stop at a rural gas station after dark again. As I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road, a man with his thumb out, hitchhiking. Normally, I never pick up hitchhikers, especially not at night, but something made me slow down. Maybe it was the bone-deep weariness that had settled into my body after so many hours of solitary driving. Or maybe it was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by that same fatigue. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling over before I could really think it through. The man jogged up to my passenger side door with a grateful smile. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with shaggy brown hair and several days' worth of stubble on his chin. His clothes were a bit ragged, but he seemed harmless enough. "Thanks so much for stopping," he said as he climbed in. "I've been out here for hours. Thought I might have to spend the night in a ditch." "No problem," I replied, though a part of me was already regretting the decision. "Where you headed?" "Just up to the next town, if you can take me that far," he said. "Name's Mike, by the way." "John," I said, not wanting to give my real name. "Nice to meet you, Mike." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but I could feel Mike studying me. The hairs on the back of my neck started to prickle. "So, what brings you out this way, John?" Mike finally asked. His tone was casual, but there was an odd intensity to it that set me on edge. "Just passing through," I said vaguely. "What about you? What did you out hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere?" Mike chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, you know how it is. Sometimes a man just needs to get away for a while. Start fresh somewhere new." I nodded non-committally, not wanting to pry, but Mike kept talking, his voice taking on a rambling quality that made me increasingly uneasy. Of course, starting fresh isn't always easy, is it? Can't ever really outrun your past. It has a way of catching up with you. I glanced over at him. His eyes had taken on a glassy, far-away look. "Guess that's true," I said cautiously. "You ever done something you regret, John?" Mike asked suddenly. "Something that keeps you up at night?" A chill ran down my spine. "Look, man, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not really one for deep conversations with strangers." Mike's head snapped towards me, his eyes suddenly sharp and alert. "No, that's a shame. I find strangers often make the best confidants. No judgment, you know. And no way to betray your secrets." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct was screaming at me that something was very wrong. I needed to get this guy out of my car. "Listen, I think maybe it's best if I let you out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a gas station about a mile up ahead. I can drop you there." Mike's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Oh no, I don't think so," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're not done here, John. Not by a long shot." I tried to wrench my arm free, but his grip was like iron. With my other hand, I fought to keep the car steady on the road. "Let go of me," I shouted. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Mike's face twisted into a snarl. "Pull over, now." "Like hell I will," I spat back. He lunged at me then, trying to grab the wheel. The car swerved wildly as I fought to maintain control. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mike reach into his jacket. My blood ran cold as I caught the glint of metal, a knife. "I said pull over," he roared, brandishing the blade at me. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I stomped on the brakes hard, causing Mike to lurch forward. His grip on the knife loosened, and I took the opportunity to smack it out of his hand. It clattered to the floor by his feet. Mike howled in rage and lunged for my throat. His hands closed around my windpipe, cutting off my air. Spots danced in my vision as I clawed at his grip. With one hand, I fumbled for the door handle. Just as my vision started to go dark, my fingers found the latch. I threw my weight against the door, and we both tumbled out onto the asphalt. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but it also broke Mike's grip. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air. Mike was already up, advancing on me with murderous intent in his eyes. I backpedaled, searching desperately for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. My foot hit something solid, a large rock by the side of the road. I scooped it up just as Mike rushed me. I swung with all my might, catching him on the side of the head. He went down hard. For a moment, I stood there panting, the rock still clutched in my shaking hand. Mike lay motionless on the ground. Panic set in. Had I killed him? I dropped to my knees, fingers frantically searching for a pulse. To my immense relief, I found one. He was just knocked out, but I knew he wouldn't stay that way for long. I staggered back to my car on unsteady legs. I had to get out of here, had to get help. As I reached for the door handle, headlights appeared on the horizon. Another car was approaching. I waved my arms frantically, praying they would stop. To my immense relief, the car slowed and pulled over. An older man peered out at me in concern. "You all right, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." The words came tumbling out in a rush. I told him everything, picking up the hitchhiker, the attack, knocking him out. The man's eyes widened as I spoke. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "All right, get in. We'll head to the police station in the next town. It's not far." I hesitated, glancing back at Mike's prone form. But what if he wakes up? What if he gets away? The man reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a cell phone. "Here, call 911. Tell them exactly where we are. They can send someone to pick him up." With shaking fingers, I dialed and relayed our location to the dispatcher. They assured me officers were on the way. As we drove towards town, the adrenaline began to wear off. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd nearly been killed. If I hadn't managed to fight back, who knows what would have happened to me. The man, Bob was his name, kept shooting concerned glances my way. "You sure you're all right? Maybe we should take you to a hospital to get checked out." I shook my head. "No, I'm okay. Just shaken up. I just want to give my statement to the police and then sleep for about a week." Bob nodded in understanding. "Well, you're safe now. And you did good, fighting him off like that. A lot of people would have frozen up." I managed a weak smile. Guess those self-defense classes my mom made me take finally paid off. We rode the rest of the way in silence. My mind kept replaying the attack, imagining all the ways it could have gone differently. All the ways I could have ended up dead on the side of that lonely highway. When we finally reached the police station, I gave my statement in a daze. The officers were sympathetic, assuring me they would track down my attacker. They offered to call someone for me, but I declined. I just wanted to be alone. I got a motel room in town, not feeling up to driving any further that night. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew sleep would be a long time coming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mike's face twisted in rage, felt his hands around my throat. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to shake off the lingering effects of that night. I jumped at unexpected noises, felt panicky in crowds. I couldn't bring myself to drive long distances, especially at night. The police eventually caught up with Mike. Turns out he was wanted in connection with several other attacks on drivers. Knowing he was behind bars brought some relief, but it didn't erase the memory of that terrifying night. It's been months now, and I'm slowly starting to feel like myself again. But I know I'll never be quite the same. That night taught me how quickly life can change, how vulnerable we all are. I'm more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings, and I never ever pick up hitchhikers. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of hands on my throat. In those moments, I have to remind myself that I'm safe, that I survived, but a part of me will always be back on that dark highway, fighting for my life against a stranger I foolishly let into my car. I don't know why Mike chose me that night, or what might have happened if I hadn't managed to fight him off. Those are questions I'll likely never have answers to. All I can do is be grateful that I made it out alive and hope that by sharing my story, I might prevent someone else from making the same mistake I did. So if you're ever driving late at night and see a hitchhiker on the side of the road, just keep driving. No matter how harmless they might seem, it's not worth the risk. Take it from someone who learned that lesson the hard way. I was so excited for our camping trip. My 3 best friends and I had been planning it for months, a chance to get away from the city, disconnect from technology, and enjoy nature for a few days. We chose a remote campsite in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from home. As we packed up the car that morning, joking and laughing, I never could have imagined the absolute terror that awaited us. The drive up was beautiful, winding through forests and alongside rivers. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon and quickly got to work setting up our tents and unpacking supplies. The site was in a small clearing surrounded by dense woods on all sides. A fire pit sat in the center, with a rustic wooden outhouse on one edge of the clearing. It was peaceful and serene, the perfect escape from city life. As evening approached, we got a campfire going and settled in with some beers, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company under the stars. Everything was going great, but around midnight, things started to feel off. It began with strange noises coming from the woods. At first, we tried to brush them off as normal forest sounds. Owls, maybe, or some small animals. But they kept getting closer and didn't sound quite right, almost like a mix between animal calls and human voices. We fell silent, straining to listen. "Did you guys hear that?" my friend Jake whispered. We all nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to reassure everyone and myself. "Let's just head to bed." We doused the fire and retreated to our tents, but sleep was impossible. The sounds continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes seeming to circle our campsite. I lay awake for hours, heart pounding, imagining all kinds of horrible possibilities. When morning finally came, we were exhausted and on edge. Over a tense breakfast, we debated whether to pack up and leave early. But in the light of day, it was hard to believe we'd really heard anything truly threatening. We decided to stick it out another night. That day, we tried to relax and enjoy ourselves, going for a hike and swimming in a nearby lake. But there was an undercurrent of unease that we couldn't shake. We kept looking over our shoulders, jumping at small noises. As dusk fell, we gathered around the fire again, speaking in hushed tones. That's when we first saw him. A tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree. He was too far away to make out clearly, but something about his stance and stillness was deeply unsettling. "Hey!" Jake called out. "Can we help you?" The figure didn't respond or move. We all stared, frozen. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly stepped back and melted into the darkness of the forest. Panic set in. We huddled close to the fire, terrified of what might be lurking just beyond the ring of light. The strange noises from the night before started up again, closer than ever. Sometimes they sounded like animals, sometimes like distorted human voices. Occasionally we caught glimpses of movement in the shadows. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Right now." We all agreed, but the thought of trying to pack up and drive on the dark, winding mountain roads was equally terrifying. We decided to wait it out until first light, taking shifts to keep watch. Those were the longest, most horrifying hours of my life. The sounds and movements continued all night. Several times we saw the tall figure again, always at the edge of the clearing, always silent and unmoving. None of us slept a wink. As soon as the sky began to lighten, we frantically started breaking down camp. That's when Jake made a chilling discovery. "Guys," he called out, voice tight with fear. "Come look at this." We hurried over to where he was standing by the old outhouse. He had noticed that the floorboards inside seemed loose and had pried one up. Underneath was a trap door leading to some kind of cellar or basement. Heart in my throat, I shone my flashlight down into the darkness. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. The cellar was full of discarded clothing, shoes, wallets, phones, clearly belongings from dozens of different people. And scratched into the walls were tally marks. Hundreds and hundreds of tally marks. We didn't say a word. We just looked at each other in horror, the realization dawning that we had narrowly escaped becoming part of whatever sick game was being played here. That's when the noises started again, louder than ever, and definitely human this time. Screams and howls that chilled me to my very core. "Run!" I yelled. We abandoned our half-packed gear and sprinted for the car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently as I tried to get the engine started. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of multiple figures emerging from the woods, moving inhumanly fast. I slammed on the gas, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. We tore down the mountain road at breakneck speed, the car fishtailing around curves. No one spoke. We were all in shock, gasping for air, unable to process what we'd just experienced. It wasn't until we hit the main highway an hour later that we finally felt safe enough to pull over and try to make sense of what had happened. We called the police, of course, but when they went to investigate, they found nothing. The cellar was empty, no sign of the belongings we'd seen. They said we must have imagined it in our fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. Sometimes I still hear those inhuman noises in my dreams, still see that tall, motionless figure watching from the shadows. I don't know who or what was in those woods that night, but I do know that none of us will ever go camping again. Just when I was about to give up hope, I spotted a small town in the distance. Relief washed over me as I approached, eager for gas, food, and directions. But as I entered the town limits, an eerie feeling crept over me. The streets were completely deserted, not a single person in sight, no cars moving, no lights on in any of the buildings. It was as if the whole town had been abandoned. I slowly cruised down the empty main street, peering into darkened storefronts. Everything looked like it was frozen in time. Old-fashioned displays in shop windows, vintage cars parked along the curb, faded signs advertising businesses that clearly hadn't been open in years. The whole scene felt like something out of the Twilight Zone. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around and get out of there, but my gas gauge was on empty, and I knew I wouldn't make it much further without refueling. I reluctantly pulled up to an old gas station, hoping against hope that the pumps might still work. As I got out of my car, the silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind. Just a heavy stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed the nozzle and tried to start pumping, but nothing happened. The power was off. Frustrated and increasingly uneasy, I decided to look for someone who could help. I started walking down the sidewalk, peering into windows and calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here? I need some help." My voice echoed off the buildings, seeming to hang in the air unnaturally. I was about to give up when I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I whirled around, but the street behind me was empty. My heart started racing. I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart between two buildings. Telling myself I was just jumpy from the weird situation, I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few steps I'd catch another glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, only for it to vanish when I turned to look. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as panic started to set in. I quickened my pace, no longer calling out. I just wanted to get back to my car and get the hell out of this creepy ghost town. As I hurried along, I noticed strange symbols carved into some of the buildings and sidewalks. Crude stick figures and odd geometric shapes that made me deeply uneasy. Just then, I heard a distinct shuffling sound behind me. I spun around and saw a figure duck into an alley about 50 feet back. My blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone was definitely following me. Heart pounding, I broke into a run. I sprinted back toward my car, not daring to look behind me. The shuffling footsteps seemed to be getting closer. I reached my vehicle and fumbled with my keys, hands shaking. Just as I got the door open, I heard a raspy voice right behind me. "You shouldn't be here, stranger." I yelped and dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. An old woman with wild gray hair and sunken eyes was standing right outside my window, glaring at me. Her skin was pallid and waxy, her teeth yellow and rotting. She looked like a corpse. "This town don't take kindly to outsiders," she hissed, pressing her face against the glass. "Best be on your way before nightfall, or you might never leave." I jammed the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start despite being almost out of gas. To my immense relief, it sputtered to life. I threw the car in reverse and peeled out of there, tires squealing. As I sped toward the town limits, more figures began emerging from the shadows. Gaunt, pale people with dead eyes, all staring at me with naked hostility. They started converging on the street, trying to block my path. I swerved around them, heart in my throat. Just as I thought I was in the clear, a man stepped out in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, nearly hitting him. He slowly walked up to my window and leaned in close. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all. When he smiled, his teeth were filed to points. "We don't get many visitors," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "It's been so long since we've had fresh meat." I stomped on the gas, not caring if I ran him over. He leapt back just in time as I floored it out of town. In my rearview mirror, I could see a crowd of those things chasing after my car, moving with inhuman speed. I didn't slow down for miles, constantly checking behind me to make sure I wasn't being followed. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, and I pulled over, shaking and hyperventilating. What the hell had just happened? Who were those people? What were those people? Part of me wanted to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination, but I knew deep down that it was real. I had stumbled into something terrifying and barely escaped. I found a motel in the next town and holed up there for the night, too rattled to keep driving. I scoured the internet for any information about an abandoned town in the area, but found nothing. It was as if the place didn't exist. The next morning, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to try to find the town again in the daylight. But no matter how I retraced my route, I couldn't locate it. The road I'd taken just led to more wilderness. The town had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of dead black eyes in a crowd, or hear that raspy voice in my dreams telling me I should have never come to their town. And I know it was real. I don't take back roads on road trips anymore. I stick to major highways with plenty of other cars and well-lit towns. But I'll never forget that night, or shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that nightmare town is still waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor. It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to embark on a solo hike through my favorite trail. The air was cool and invigorating, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. As I laced up my hiking boots and packed my backpack with water and snacks, I felt a sense of excitement bubbling up inside me. This was my element, where I felt most alive. The trail started off easy enough, winding through familiar terrain that I had traversed countless times before. The sound of crunching leaves beneath my feet and the occasional chirping of birds were the only sounds breaking the silence. About an hour into my hike, I decided to veer off the main path and explore a less traveled route that I had been meaning to check out for a while. As I pushed deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser and the undergrowth became thicker. The canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows all around me. It was then that I first felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar surroundings. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step I took. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, searching for any sign of movement in the thick foliage. My heart rate quickened, and I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead despite the cool air. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, my eyes darting frantically from tree to tree, trying to spot the source of the noise. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. "Is someone there?" Silence was the only response, but I could have sworn I saw a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. Panic began to set in as I realized how isolated I was. I had no cell phone signal out here, and I was miles away from the nearest town. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about exploring new trails. My only thought was getting back to the safety of my car. As I hurried along, I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace. They were too heavy to be an animal, and too deliberate to be my imagination. My blood ran cold as I realized the horrifying truth. Someone was following me. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging scratches, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was putting as much distance as possible between me and my pursuer. The footsteps behind me quickened too, and I could hear heavy breathing getting closer. In a moment of pure terror, I risked a glance over my shoulder, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a face I recognized, someone I knew from my small town. But their eyes were wild, filled with a manic intensity that I had never seen before. This wasn't a chance encounter. This person had been stalking me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fueled by sheer adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. I could hear my stalker crashing through the woods behind me, closing the distance with each passing second. In my panic, I lost all sense of direction. The trees all looked the same, and I had no idea if I was heading towards safety or deeper into danger. I stumbled over roots and rocks, each time certain that this would be the moment my pursuer caught up to me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I spotted a small ravine up ahead. Without hesitation, I made a sharp turn and half ran, half slid down the steep incline. Loose rocks and dirt cascaded down with me, and I prayed that the noise would mask my movements. At the bottom of the ravine, I pressed myself against the damp earth, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, listening intently for any sign of my stalker. I could hear them above, pacing back and forth, searching for any trace of where I had gone. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, every muscle in my body tense and ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Eventually, the sounds of movement above faded away, but I didn't dare move. I stayed in that spot until the light began to fade from the sky, terrified that any movement would reveal my location. As darkness fell, I finally mustered the courage to move. With shaking limbs, I climbed out of the ravine and tried to orient myself. By some miracle, I managed to find my way back to the main trail and from there to my car. I've never felt such overwhelming relief as I did when I saw that familiar vehicle waiting for me. I sped to the nearest police station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The officers listened to my frantic story with concern, taking down every detail I could remember about my stalker. They promised to investigate and advised me to stay with friends or family for the time being. That night, as I lay awake in my best friend's spare room, every creaking floorboard and rustling leaf outside sent waves of panic through me. I couldn't shake the image of those wild, manic eyes pursuing me through the forest. In the days and weeks that followed, the police searched the area but found no concrete evidence of my stalker. They questioned the person I had recognized, but without proof, there was little they could do. I was left feeling vulnerable and exposed, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at shadows. The event changed me profoundly. My love for nature, once a source of joy and peace, was now tainted with fear and anxiety. I couldn't bring myself to go hiking alone anymore, and even group outings filled me with dread. The forest, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a sinister place full of hidden dangers. I sought therapy to help cope with the trauma, but the fear lingered. I installed security cameras around my house and rarely went out after dark. My friends and family tried to understand, but I could see the concern in their eyes as they watched me withdraw from activities I once loved. Months passed, and while the acute terror subsided, a constant undercurrent of anxiety remained. I found myself studying the faces of people in town, wondering if my stalker was among them, waiting for another opportunity. The not knowing was almost as bad as the chase itself. I felt like I was living in a state of suspended fear, never sure when or if the other shoe would drop. As time went on, I slowly began to reclaim parts of my life. I started with short walks in well-populated parks, gradually working my way up to group hikes on busy trails. But I knew I would never again experience the carefree joy of a solitary wilderness adventure. That part of me was lost in the forest that day, along with my sense of safety and trust in the world around me. Looking back now, I still can't fully explain what happened that day. Was it a random act of malice, or had I been targeted specifically? The questions continue to haunt me, keeping me awake on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window. I share this story as a warning to others who might think they're safe in the solitude of nature. Always let someone know where you're going, carry a means of communication, and trust your instincts. The wilderness can be beautiful, but it can also hide dangers both natural and human. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, my stalker is still watching, waiting for another chance. And so, I remain vigilant, forever changed by that terrifying day in the forest when I learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that walk on two legs. I was so excited to move to Millbrook, a quaint little town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. After years of living in cramped city apartments, I was ready for some peace and quiet. The charming Victorian house I bought seemed perfect. Spacious rooms, a wrap-around porch, and best of all, friendly neighbors who welcomed me with freshly baked pies and offers to help me settle in. At least that's what I thought at first. It didn't take long for me to realize something was off about this place. Little things at first, hushed conversations that would abruptly stop when I walked by, strange symbols I'd catch glimpses of carved into tree trunks or scratched onto mailboxes. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid in an unfamiliar place. But then came that first night I heard the chanting. I jolted awake around 3 a.m. to an eerie, rhythmic sound echoing through the otherwise silent night. Peering out my bedroom window, I saw flickering lights in the woods behind my house. A group of shadowy figures moved in a circle around what looked like a bonfire. The chanting grew louder, the words incomprehensible, but filled with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just some weird small-town tradition I didn't understand yet. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The next day, I tried casually asking my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, if she'd heard any strange noises in the night. The sweet old lady who'd brought me a blueberry pie when I moved in suddenly transformed before my eyes. Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare that made my blood run cold. "Best not to concern yourself with such things," she said in a clipped tone. "Some matters in this town aren't for outsiders to understand." With that, she turned and walked briskly back to her house, leaving me stunned on the sidewalk. From that moment on, I felt eyes on me constantly. Neighbors who'd been friendly before now regarded me with suspicion. When I went for walks, conversations would hush as I passed by. Cars would slow down and trail behind me. One evening, I came home to find a strange object on my porch, a crude doll made of twigs and what looked disturbingly like human hair, with pins jabbed through its chest. Pinned to it was a note that simply read, "Leave now." I was terrified, but also angry. Who were these people to try to drive me out of my own home? I marched next door, pounding on Mrs. Henderson's door and demanding answers. She opened the door a crack, peering out with eyes that now seemed to glow with an unnatural light. "You were warned," she hissed. "This is your last chance. Pack your things and go, or suffer the consequences." I stumbled back, my head spinning. This couldn't be happening. It was like I'd stepped into some surreal nightmare version of my quaint little town. That night, the chanting in the woods was louder than ever. I huddled in my bed, my whole body shaking as I listened to the otherworldly sounds. Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash downstairs. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. My bedroom door burst open. 3 figures in dark robes stood there, faces obscured by hoods. One held a knife that glinted in the moonlight, streaming through my window. "You should have listened," a voice growled. I leapt from the bed, adrenaline coursing through me. Somehow I managed to shove past them and race down the stairs. I could hear them in pursuit as I fled out the front door and ran blindly down the street. My lungs were burning as I sprinted through the dark town. Lights were flicking on in houses, more robed figures emerging to join the chase. Their chanting filled the air, seeming to come from all directions. I made it to the edge of town, my car mercifully still parked where I'd left it earlier. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys and practically dove inside. The engine roared to life and I slammed on the gas, tires squealing as I peeled away. In my rearview mirror, I could see the mob of robed figures gathered at the town line. Their chanting grew to a fevered pitch, then abruptly cut off as I sped out of earshot. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Millbrook. My mind was reeling, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Had it all been some kind of mass hallucination? A bizarre prank gone too far? But I knew deep down that what I'd witnessed was all too real. That quaint little town was hiding dark, terrifying secrets. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've tried researching the history of Millbrook, looking for any clues about what might be going on there. But there's nothing. No reports of strange activity, no mysterious disappearances. It's like the whole town is shrouded in secrecy. Sometimes I wonder if I should report what happened to the authorities. But who would believe such an insane story? And what if somehow word got back to the people of Millbrook? The thought makes me break out in a cold sweat. So I've tried my best to move on and forget. I'm in a new city now, slowly rebuilding my life. But I know I'll never be the same after what I experienced in that town. There are things in this world that defy explanation, dark forces lurking just beneath the surface of what we think of as normal life. And sometimes, no matter how hard we try to ignore them, those forces find us. All we can do is run and hope they don't follow. I often find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a hooded figure watching me from the shadows. The chanting still echoes in my dreams. And on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I can almost imagine I hear voices calling me back to Millbrook. But I'll never go back there. Some secrets are best left buried, some mysteries unsolved. I only hope that whatever malevolent presence lurks in that town stays contained there, never spreading beyond its borders to infect the outside world. If you're ever driving through upstate New York and see signs for Millbrook, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't even slow down. Some places aren't meant for outsiders, and some truths are too terrible to face. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry the scars of that knowledge for the rest of my life. I was driving through the Mojave Desert on my way to visit family in Arizona. It was a scorching hot day, and I'd been on the road for hours. The monotonous landscape of sand and scrub brush stretched endlessly in every direction. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow across the desert, I noticed my gas gauge was getting low. I hadn't seen a gas station in ages, but I figured I had enough to make it to the next town. That's when things started to get weird. Up ahead, I saw what looked like an abandoned car on the side of the road. As I got closer, I could make out that it was an old station wagon, probably from the 70s. The paint was faded and peeling, and it was covered in a thick layer of dust. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something made me slow down as I approached. That's when I heard it, a faint muffled sound coming from inside the car. It sounded almost like crying. A chill ran down my spine. I pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. Part of me wanted to just keep driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be in trouble. I got out of my car, the oppressive heat hitting me like a wall. As I walked towards the station wagon, the crying sound got louder. It definitely seemed to be coming from inside. I hesitated, then called out, Hello? Is anyone in there? Do you need help? The crying abruptly stopped. An uneasy silence fell over the desert. I took a few more steps towards the car, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the windows were all rolled up, despite the blistering heat, and they were covered in a thick layer of grime. There was no way I could see inside. I reached for the door handle, but just as my fingers brushed the metal, I heard a loud bang from inside the car. I jumped back, my pulse racing. What the hell was that? It sounded almost like a gunshot. Suddenly overcome with a sense of dread, I turned and ran back to my car. As I peeled away, I could have sworn I saw movement in my rearview mirror, like a dark shape rising up in the back of the station wagon. But when I looked again, it was gone. I tried to calm myself down as I drove. It was probably just my imagination running wild, right? The heat and exhaustion were clearly getting to me. I cranked up the AC and focused on the road ahead. But as the last light faded from the sky, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it. I was relieved to see another car out here. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the car behind me wasn't passing or falling back. It was maintaining the exact same distance, no matter how I varied my speed. An uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I sped up a little, and the car behind me sped up too. I slowed down, and it slowed down to match. What the hell? My palms started to sweat as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I tried to get a better look at the car in my mirrors, but all I could make out were the glaring headlights. They seemed unnaturally bright, casting long shadows across the empty desert. After about 20 minutes of this, I was starting to freak out. My gas gauge was dangerously low, and there was still no sign of the next town. I decided to pull over and let the other car pass. Maybe it was just some oblivious driver who didn't realize how creepy they were being. I eased onto the shoulder and came to a stop, heart pounding as I waited for the other car to go by. But to my horror, it pulled over right behind me, headlights still blazing. I sat there frozen for a moment, unsure what to do. Should I get out and confront them? Try to speed away? As I debated my options, I saw the driver's door of the other car start to open. Panic surged through me. I slammed on the gas, my tires spinning in the loose gravel before finding purchase. I took off down the highway, pushing my old Honda to its limits. In my rearview mirror, I saw the other car peel out after me. But something was off about it. The headlights seemed to flicker and waver like they weren't quite solid, and the outline of the car itself seemed to shimmer and distort. I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, the car behind me had changed completely. It was now a sleek black muscle car, chrome gleaming in the moonlight. What the hell? I rubbed my eyes, my head starting to spin. When I looked back, the car had changed again. Now it was a battered pickup truck. As I watched in disbelief, it kept morphing every few seconds. Sports car, minivan, motorcycle. It was like flipping through TV channels. My vision started to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges. The gas gauge needle was bouncing on empty. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just as I was about to give up hope, I saw lights up ahead. A gas station. I pulled in on fumes, frantically looking behind me, but the highway was empty. The pursuing vehicle had vanished. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. As I got out to pump gas, the night attendant came out of the little shop. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost?" I laughed shakily. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." He raised an eyebrow. "Try me. I've heard some wild stories from folks coming through here." So I told him everything. The abandoned car, the pursuing vehicle, all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're not the first to come through here with a story like that," he said finally. "There's something weird about this stretch of desert. People see things out there, things that can't be explained." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "I've worked this station for 20 years. I've heard it all. Phantom hitchhikers, cars that disappear into thin air, mysterious lights in the sky. Some folks say it's aliens. Others think it's some kind of government experiment. Me? I think it's the desert itself. Something about this place. It gets in your head, makes you see things." I nodded slowly, relief washing over me. So I wasn't going crazy after all. But then the attendant continued. "Of course, that doesn't mean what you saw wasn't real. Just because we can't explain something doesn't mean it didn't happen." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What are you saying?" He shrugged. "I'm saying be careful out there and maybe find a different route home." As I pulled back onto the highway, his words echoed in my mind. I kept a white-knuckle grip on the steering wheel, jumping at every shadow. But the rest of my drive was uneventful. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the memory of what I saw. Was it all just a hallucination brought on by heat and exhaustion? Or is there really something out there in the desert? Something beyond our understanding? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but one thing's for sure. I'm never driving through the Mojave at night again. And if you find yourself on that lonely stretch of highway as the sun goes down, keep your eyes on the road and watch your rearview mirror. You never know what might be following you through the darkness. I was out for my usual weekend hike in the woods near my hometown, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. The trail I typically followed wound through dense forest before opening up to some rocky hillsides with nice views of the valley below. I'd done this hike dozens of times before, but on this particular day, something caught my eye that I'd never noticed. As I was making my way along a steep section of trail that hugged the side of a hill, I spotted what looked like a glint of metal peeking out from behind some bushes and fallen leaves. Curious, I veered off the path to investigate. Pushing aside the undergrowth, I was shocked to find myself face to face with a heavy steel door set into the hillside. My heart started racing as I stared at the door in disbelief. How had I never seen this before? It was well hidden, but still, I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. The door was clearly man-made, with no visible handles or locks, just smooth, weathered metal. It looked old, like it had been there for decades. I hesitated, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back and pretend I'd never seen it. But my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was behind that door. I pushed against it experimentally, not really expecting anything to happen. To my shock, it swung open with a low groan. Stale, musty air wafted out as I peered into the darkness beyond. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam illuminated a narrow passageway leading down into the earth. Graffiti and cobwebs covered the concrete walls. Despite every instinct telling me to leave, I found myself stepping inside. The passage sloped gently downward for about 50 feet before opening up into a larger chamber. As I swept my light around, I realized I was standing in some kind of underground bunker. The room was maybe 30 feet across, with a low ceiling and bare concrete walls. Rusty metal shelves lined the walls, holding dusty cans and supplies. In the center was a table with some chairs scattered around it. My mouth went dry as I took in the scene. This wasn't just some kid's secret clubhouse. This was a serious survival bunker, built to withstand who knows what. But who had built it? And why here, in the middle of nowhere? As I moved further into the room, my light fell on something that made my blood run cold. There were dark stains on the floor, lots of them. They looked horribly like dried blood, and not just a little blood, but huge smears and spatters, as if there had been a violent struggle. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. What the hell had happened down here? My mind raced with horrible possibilities. I needed to get out, to call the police. But as I turned to leave, something on the floor caught my eye. I crouched down for a closer look. It was a bullet casing. My hands trembling, I reached out to touch it. The metal was still warm. Pure terror jolted through me. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't ancient history. It was recent, maybe even within the last few hours, which meant whoever was responsible could still be nearby. I bolted for the exit, my heart pounding in my ears. As I raced up the passageway, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. I burst out of the door and into the sunlight, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was back on the main trail. As I hurried back towards my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the woods behind me. But there was never anyone there. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there shaking for several minutes. Should I call the police? But what would I even say? I had no proof of anything except my own wild story, and part of me was terrified of getting involved any further. In the end, I drove home in silence, my mind reeling. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bunker, the bloodstains, the bullet casing. I couldn't stop wondering what horrible things had happened down there, and I couldn't shake the gut-wrenching certainty that by stumbling upon that place, I'd put myself in terrible danger. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I jumped at every unexpected sound. I felt eyes on me constantly, even in my own home. I considered leaving town, but where would I go? How could I explain it to anyone? A week after my discovery, I worked up the courage to go back. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe proof that I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I reached the spot where I'd found the door, there was nothing there. No door, no disturbed earth, not even a trace that anything had ever been there at all. If it weren't for the lingering terror I felt, I could almost believe I'd dreamed the whole thing. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Was it some kind of secret government facility? A hideout for criminals? Or something even darker and stranger? All I know is that stumbling upon that bunker changed me forever. I no longer feel safe in the woods I once loved. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more, told someone, investigated further. But then I remember the fear I felt that day, the absolute certainty that I'd stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. And I know that staying silent was the only way to stay alive. I still hike sometimes, but never alone, and never on that particular trail. Yet, no matter where I go, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched, that somewhere out there, whoever or whatever was in that bunker is still out there, waiting, and sooner or later they'll come for me. So I live each day looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, and wondering when the truth of what I saw will finally catch up with me. Because deep down, I know it's not a question of if, but when. And all I can do is hope that when that day comes, I'll be ready. Shit, I muttered, pulling over onto the shoulder. I popped the hood and was immediately engulfed in a cloud of acrid smoke. Once it cleared, I peered at the engine, but who was I kidding? I know nothing about cars. Whatever was wrong, it was well beyond my abilities to fix. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for a tow, but of course there was no signal out here in the boonies. Perfect. Just perfect. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere as night was falling. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat and started walking, hoping I'd come across some sign of civilization before too long. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. Any other time, it might have been beautiful, but right then, it just filled me with a gnawing sense of dread. After what felt like hours of walking in the growing darkness, I finally saw a faint glow of lights up ahead. As I got closer, I made out a dilapidated sign for the Pinewood Motel. It looked like it had seen better days, paint peeling, neon flickering weakly. But at that point, I was ready to sleep in a ditch. This would have to do. I pushed open the office door, setting off a tinny bell. The place smelled musty and stale. An ancient TV droned in the corner, filling the room with staticky blue light. After a moment, a wizened old man shuffled out from a back room. "Need a room," I said, trying not to breathe too deeply. He squinted at me, then wordlessly turned to grab a key off the pegboard behind him. "Room 13, he rasped. $40 cash." I handed over 2 crumpled 20s and took the key. "Any place I can get something to eat around here?" He shook his head. "Vending machines busted. Nearest town's 30 miles that away." He jerked a gnarled thumb over his shoulder. Great. I was tired and starving, but there was nothing to be done about it now. I trudged out to find my room, gravel crunching under my feet. Room 13 was at the very end of the building. The key stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it before the door finally creaked open. The smell hit me first, musty and dank, with an underlying whiff of mildew. Lovely. I flicked on the light switch, illuminating a sad little room that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Faded floral wallpaper was peeling at the seams. The bedspread was a hideous orange and brown pattern. A small TV sat on a rickety-looking dresser, rabbit ear antennae askew. But it was a place to sleep, and that's all I needed right then. I tossed my backpack on the bed and headed for the bathroom. The fluorescent light buzzed and flickered as I flipped the switch. The sink was stained with rust, and something dark was growing in the corners of the shower. I decided a shower could wait till morning. I flopped onto the bed, not even bothering to get under the covers. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless and filled with unsettling dreams. I kept jolting awake, disoriented in the unfamiliar room. Each time, my eyes were drawn to the gap under the door, where a sliver of sickly yellow light from the parking lot seeped in. It was during one of these periods of half-wakefulness that I first noticed the shadows moving outside. At first I thought I was imagining things, still caught in the haze of an uneasy dream. But as I stared at that strip of light, I saw them again. Dark shapes passing by, momentarily blocking out the glow. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, probably just other guests heading to their rooms, but something about the way they moved set my nerves on edge. It was too fluid, too purposeful. I lay there frozen, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it. The softest scrape of metal on metal, the sound of someone trying the doorknob. Ice flooded my veins. This wasn't right. No one should be trying to get into my room in the middle of the night. I held my breath, praying they'd move on. The doorknob rattled again, more insistently this time. Then came a series of soft thuds, someone pressing their shoulder against the door, testing its strength. I was fully awake now, adrenaline coursing through me. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, looking around frantically for a weapon. The lamp was too bulky, the TV too heavy. My eyes landed on my backpack. The trekking poles clipped to the outside. Those would have to do. I had just grabbed one of the poles when I heard a new sound that made my blood run cold, the scratch of a key in the lock. Oh God, they had a key. The door burst open and dark figures poured in. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, dressed all in black with hoods obscuring their faces. I caught a flash of something metallic in one of their hands. I didn't have time to think. Pure instinct took over, and I swung the trekking pole with all my might. It connected with a satisfying thwack, and one of the figures stumbled back with a grunt of pain. But there were too many of them. Hands grabbed at me from all sides. I thrashed and kicked, managing to land a few solid blows, but they kept coming, inexorable as the tide. I opened my mouth to scream, but a gloved hand clamped down, muffling my cries. I felt the prick of a needle in my neck. Almost immediately, the room began to spin. My limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. As darkness crept in at the edges of my vision, I had one last coherent thought. This is how I die. But then the world exploded in sound and light. There were shouts, the crack of gunfire. The hands holding me suddenly released, and I crumpled to the floor. I don't know how long I lay there, fading in and out of consciousness. When I finally managed to focus, I found myself staring at a pair of polished black shoes. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Sir? Sir? Can you hear me?" A face swam into view, a police officer looking down at me with concern. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a croak. The officer helped me sit up, and I saw that the room was now crawling with cops. EMTs were tending to someone on the floor, one of my attackers, I realized with a jolt. "You're safe now," the officer was saying. "We got here just in time. Can you tell me what happened?" I shook my head, still struggling to process everything. They came in, tried to take me." My voice sounded strange and far away. The officer nodded grimly. "We've been tracking this group for months, human traffickers. They've been targeting isolated motels like this one, preying on vulnerable travelers." A chill ran through me as the full implications of what he was saying sank in. If the police hadn't shown up when they did, the next few hours passed in a blur. I was checked out by the EMTs, questioned by detectives, given a blanket and a cup of truly terrible coffee. By the time dawn broke, I was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, heading to the station to give my official statement. As we drove away from the Pinewood Motel, I caught a glimpse of my car being loaded onto a tow truck. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude for that broken-down engine. If it hadn't died when it did, I never would have stopped at this motel. I would have driven on, oblivious, while some other poor soul fell victim to those monsters. It's been months now, and I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, phantom hands grabbing at me in the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe in a motel again, but I'm alive, and for that I'm endlessly thankful. I later learned that the police had been staking out the motel, acting on an anonymous tip. They'd arrived just in time to catch the traffickers in the act. Most of the group was arrested that night, though a few managed to slip away in the chaos. The old man who ran the front desk turned out to be in on it. He'd alert the group whenever a likely target checked in, usually solo travelers, people who seemed down on their luck or unlikely to be missed. It makes me sick to think about how many people might have disappeared from that godforsaken place over the years. I gave my testimony at the trial, along with several other survivors who came forward. It was brutal, having to relive that night. But knowing that those monsters would be locked away for a long, long time made it worth it. These days, I'm a lot more cautious when I travel. I always make sure someone knows where I am, and I trust my gut when a place feels off. But I won't let fear keep me from exploring the world. If anything, this experience has made me more determined to live life to the fullest. Still, there are nights when I lie awake, remembering the feel of those hands grabbing me in the darkness. I don't know if that fear will ever fully go away, but I'm alive and I'm free, and that's more than enough. I was an avid hiker, always seeking out new trails and hidden corners of nature to explore. That fateful day started like any other. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, and first aid supplies, laced up my well-worn boots, and headed out to a remote forest I'd been wanting to check out for months. The trail was overgrown and clearly not well-traveled, which only added to my excitement. I loved the feeling of discovering untouched wilderness. As I trekked deeper into the dense woods, the canopy of leaves overhead grew thicker, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. An unsettling stillness hung in the air, no birds chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just a heavy silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After a few hours of hiking, I noticed wisps of what looked like smoke drifting between the trees up ahead. Curious, I veered off the barely visible trail to investigate. As I got closer, I caught the acrid scent of burning herbs and heard faint chanting carried on the breeze. My heart started to race. What the hell was going on out here in the middle of nowhere? I crept forward as quietly as I could, crouching behind a thick oak tree at the edge of a small clearing. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of about a dozen people stood in a circle, wearing dark hooded robes that obscured their faces. In the center was a crude stone altar, where a robed figure was waving some kind of smoking bundle over a collection of objects I couldn't quite make out. The chanting grew louder, the voices blending together in a guttural, rhythmic drone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I knew I needed to get out of there fast, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the disturbing scene before me. Just as I finally snapped out of it and started to back away, my foot came down on a dry branch with a sharp crack. The chanting abruptly stopped. A dozen hooded heads swiveled in my direction. Panic exploded in my chest as I turned and ran blindly into the woods. I could hear shouts behind me, followed by the sound of multiple people crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted between the trees, my lungs burning. I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed to come alive around me, shadows shifting and dancing at the edges of my vision. More than once I could have sworn I saw dark shapes flitting between the trees, trying to cut me off. But every time I looked directly at them, there was nothing there. I lost all sense of direction as I fled deeper into the wilderness. The only thought in my mind was to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I went sprawling, tumbling down a steep slope. I hit the bottom hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I lay there gasping for breath, I became aware of an eerie quiet settling over the forest once again. The sounds of pursuit had faded away. Slowly, I picked myself up, wincing at the scrapes and bruises covering my arms and legs. Miraculously, nothing seemed to be broken. I stood stock still, straining my ears for any hint of my pursuers. But there was nothing, no voices, no footsteps, not even the normal sounds of the forest. Just that same oppressive silence from earlier. My relief was short-lived as I realized I was now hopelessly lost. The sun was getting low on the horizon, and I had no idea which direction I'd come from. Panic started to set in again as I contemplated spending the night alone in these woods, knowing what or who was out there. I picked a direction at random and started walking, hoping to stumble across a trail or some sign of civilization before dark. As the shadows lengthened, that creeping sense of being watched returned. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me whirling around, half expecting to see those robed figures emerging from the gloom. Just when I was about to give up hope, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. Headlights on a road. I broke into a run, ignoring the protest of my aching muscles. I burst out of the tree line onto the shoulder of a winding country road, waving my arms frantically at an approaching pickup truck. The elderly couple inside eyed me warily as they slowed to a stop. I must have looked a fright, clothes torn and dirty, covered in scratches, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. I babbled out some story about getting lost while hiking, leaving out any mention of what I'd seen in that clearing. They agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town, though I could tell they were uneasy about letting a disheveled stranger into their vehicle. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the side mirror, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. More than once I thought I saw movement in the trees lining the road, but it was probably just my frayed nerves playing tricks on me. I didn't start to relax until we pulled into a brightly lit gas station on the outskirts of town. I thanked the couple profusely and went inside to call for a ride home. While I waited, I bought some water and tried to make myself look somewhat presentable in the grimy bathroom mirror. The scratch marks on my arms and face looked angry and inflamed. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw strange symbols etched into my skin alongside the scrapes. But when I looked closer, they were gone. That night, safe in my own bed, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined or exaggerated what I'd seen in the woods. Maybe it was just some harmless pagan group doing their thing. Maybe the strange phenomena during my escape were just products of my panicked mind. But deep down, I knew something truly sinister had been going on in that clearing. In the days and weeks that followed, I was plagued by vivid nightmares of hooded figures chasing me through endless dark forests. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, sheets tangled around me, the sound of that droning chant echoing in my ears. More than once, I could have sworn I saw hooded shapes lurking at the edges of my vision, only to disappear when I looked directly at them. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every unexpected sound. I stopped going on hikes or spending any time in secluded outdoor areas. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. They'd think I was crazy. As time passed, the nightmares gradually became less frequent, and the feeling of being watched slowly faded. But I never forgot what I saw that day, and I never went back to those woods. Sometimes I'm tempted to do some research to see if there have been any other strange sightings or incidents in that area, but mostly I just try not to think about it. I still don't know exactly what I stumbled upon in that forest clearing. Was it some kind of cult? A coven of witches? Something even darker and more inexplicable? All I know is that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation, hidden away in the shadows just beyond the edge of civilization. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just find yourself face to face with them. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrific. And in my darkest moments, I wonder if maybe I didn't really escape at all. If somehow, in some way I can't quite grasp, a part of me is still running through those woods, pursued by nameless terrors that lurk just out of sight. As I squinted through the windshield, desperately searching for any landmarks, a flash of lightning illuminated an old farmhouse set back from the road. Relief washed over me. Maybe I could wait out the worst of the storm there. I turned onto the gravel driveway, my tires crunching over the loose rocks. As I got closer, I could see the farmhouse was clearly abandoned. The white paint was peeling, shutters hung crooked, and weeds had overtaken the yard. Still, it was better than trying to navigate these back roads in this weather. I pulled up close to the porch and cut the engine. The silence was eerie after the constant drone of my car. I could hear the wind howling and rain lashing against the metal roof of my sedan. Another crack of lightning lit up the night sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. I yelped in surprise, my heart racing. Grabbing my phone for light, I made a mad dash for the porch. The old wooden steps creaked ominously under my feet as I climbed up. I tried the front door and was surprised to find it unlocked. With a shrug, I stepped inside. The musty smell of decay and abandonment assaulted my nose immediately. My phone's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and dusty furniture draped in sheets. It looked like no one had been here in years. I made my way to what I assumed was the living room, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. An old brick fireplace dominated one wall. Thankfully, there was a pile of firewood nearby. At least I wouldn't freeze tonight. As I bent to start arranging logs in the fireplace, I heard a soft thump from upstairs. I froze, straining my ears. It came again. Thump, 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 like slow, heavy footsteps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. I shook my head, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably just the wind, or maybe some animal that had gotten in. Nothing to worry about. I turned my attention back to building a fire. Soon I had a small blaze going, casting flickering shadows around the room. I settled onto the dusty couch, pulling out my phone to let my sister know I was okay. No signal. Great. As I stared into the flames, trying to relax, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just shadows dancing on the wall. My skin prickled. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Thump, thump, thump. There it was again, those slow, heavy footsteps from above. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling. The footsteps seemed to be moving, crossing the room directly over my head. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But then I heard it, a long, low moan that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded almost human, but distorted somehow. Pained, angry. I leapt to my feet, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "This isn't funny." The moan came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, to my horror, I saw a figure materialize at the top of the stairs. It was hazy and indistinct, like looking at a person through frosted glass. But I could make out the basic shape, tall and unnaturally thin, with long, gangly limbs. Its head was oversized and misshapen. I stumbled backwards, knocking over an end table. The crash seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. The figure began to descend the stairs, each step punctuated by that horrible thump, 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 thump. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed with terror as the specter drew closer. When it reached the bottom of the stairs, it turned its head towards me with agonizing slowness. Where its face should have been was just a swirling void of darkness. A scream built in my throat but died before it could escape my lips. The thing began to glide towards me, its feet never quite touching the ground. I finally managed to unfreeze, scrambling backwards until my back hit the wall. "Stay away!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Please, just leave me alone!" The spirit paid no heed to my pleas. It drifted closer and closer, that terrible moaning growing louder. I could feel the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath came out in visible puffs as icy fingers of dread clawed at my heart. Just as the apparition was about to reach me, there was a blinding flash of lightning and deafening crack of thunder. The lights in the house suddenly blazed to life, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the ghost was gone. I was alone in the room once more. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall, shaking uncontrollably. What the hell had just happened? I wanted nothing more than to run out of that house and never look back. But the storm was still raging outside. I was trapped here until morning. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house settling. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless spectre drifting towards me. As the pale light of dawn finally began to seep through the grimy windows, I bolted for my car. I didn't even bother grabbing my things. I just wanted out of there as fast as possible. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I allowed myself to relax slightly, but I couldn't shake the bone-deep chill that had settled into my body. I tried to tell myself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had experienced in that farmhouse was all too real. To this day, I can't drive down a country road without breaking into a cold sweat. The slightest glimpse of an old farmhouse sends me into a panic. I've tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis. Nothing helps. The terror of that night has become a part of me, as real and tangible as my own shadow. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I swear I can still hear that mournful moan echoing in the distance. And I know that somewhere out there, in a decaying farmhouse forgotten by time, that faceless spectre is waiting for the next unwary traveler to stumble upon its domain. I don't know if I'll ever be free of the horror I experienced that night. All I can do is share my story as a warning to others. If you're ever driving down a lonely country road late at night and you see an old farmhouse looming in the darkness, keep driving. No matter how bad the storm, no matter how tired you are, just keep going, because you never know what might be waiting for you behind that unlocked door. And trust me, some things are far worse than any storm. That's when I first heard it, another set of footsteps out of sync with my own. I glanced back, but saw only darkness behind me. Shaking my head, I picked up my pace a bit, probably just echoes playing tricks on me. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. I spun around again, heart pounding. Nothing there, just shadows and silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened. No response. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to walk at a normal pace, fighting the urge to break into a run. The footsteps started up again almost immediately, quick, purposeful steps, gaining on me. I gave up all pretense of calm and started jogging, then full-on sprinting. The footsteps behind me sped up to match. Terror seized me as I realized I was being hunted. I darted down a side alley, hoping to lose my pursuer. The footsteps followed, never missing a beat. I zigzagged through a maze of back streets, my lungs burning in the icy air. But no matter how I tried to shake them, those relentless footsteps stayed right on my heels. Panic clouded my mind. I had no idea where I was anymore. The identical brick walls and fire escapes all blurred together. I was hopelessly lost in a nightmare labyrinth, being chased by an unseen predator. I spotted a recessed doorway up ahead and made a split-second decision. I dove into the shadowy alcove, pressing myself against the door and holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My pursuer was almost upon me. Then, miraculously, they continued past my hiding spot without slowing. I waited until they faded into the distance before sagging with relief. I'd done it. I'd lost them. I gave myself a few minutes to catch my breath and calm my racing heart before cautiously peeking out. The alley was empty in both directions. I stepped out, ready to retrace my steps and find my way home. That's when a hand clamped down on my shoulder from behind. I screamed and whirled around, fists raised to defend myself, but there was no one there, just empty air where a person should have been. I backed away, eyes darting wildly in every direction. What the hell was happening? The hand on my shoulder had felt so real, firm, ice-cold fingers digging into my flesh, but it was impossible. I'd been backed up against a solid brick wall. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down my spine. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth or strategy. I just needed to get out of there, to get home where it was safe. I sprinted blindly through the maze of alleys, no longer hearing footsteps, but imagining phantom hands reaching for me from every shadow. Finally, blessedly, I burst out onto a main road. A few cars drove past, their headlights chasing away the darkness. I'd never been so relieved to see other people in my life. I made it home in record time, slamming and locking the door behind me. I did a thorough search of my apartment, checking under the bed and in all the closets like a kid afraid of monsters. Finding nothing, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. As my panic ebbed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I really had imagined it all? Sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination could do strange things to a person's mind. But then I caught sight of myself in the mirror and froze. There on my shoulder, stark against my pale skin, were 5 distinct bruises, perfectly spaced finger marks like someone had gripped me hard enough to leave lasting marks. I stared at my reflection in horror, my entire body going cold. It hadn't been my imagination. Something had been chasing me through those alleys, something that could somehow remain unseen while leaving very real, physical evidence of its existence. I slept with the lights on that night and for many nights after. I changed my route home from work, sticking to busy main roads, even though it took twice as long. I bought pepper spray and a personal alarm to carry with me at all times, but none of it has helped me shake the bone-deep fear that took root that night. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. I feel watched, even in the safety of my own home. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my door. But when I work up the courage to look, there's never anyone there. Just empty hallways and that lingering sense of dread. I don't know what was chasing me that night. I don't know if it's still out there, waiting for another chance to hunt me down. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. The fear has become a constant companion, as real and tangible as those bruises on my shoulder. I've tried talking to friends about it, but they all think I'm either making it up or that I had some kind of mental break. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am losing my mind. But those footsteps, that icy grip, it all felt so real. I've done research, trying to find any similar experiences. I've read about shadow people. about interdimensional beings that can reach into our world. Nothing quite fits what happened to me. Part of me hopes I never find an explanation. Because if what chased me that night is real, if there really are things lurking in the shadows that we can't see or understand, then the world is a much darker and more terrifying place than I ever imagined. All I can do now is stay vigilant, avoid dark alleys, and hope that whatever it was doesn't find me again. But deep down, I know the truth. I'll never truly escape that night. Those phantom footsteps will follow me for the rest of my life, always just a few steps behind. As I settled onto the couch with a cup of hot tea, I heard a faint noise coming from downstairs. At first, I dismissed it as just the usual creaks and groans of my old house settling. But as the minutes ticked by, the sounds became more distinct and unsettling. There was a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Then a dull thud, followed by what sounded like hushed whispers. My heart began to race as I realized these were not normal house noises. Someone, or something, was in my home. I sat frozen, straining my ears to track the sounds. They seemed to be coming from the living room downstairs. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I forgotten to lock a door or window? Was it just an animal that had gotten in somehow, or was I in real danger? The logical part of my brain told me to call the police immediately, but a morbid curiosity took hold. I had to know what was going on down there. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept towards the stairs, my body tense and alert. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way down. I cringed at each tiny sound, certain it would alert the intruder to my presence. When I reached the bottom, I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding in my chest. The noises continued, growing louder as I inched closer to the living room. It sounded like someone rifling through drawers and moving objects around. A chill ran down my spine as I imagined a stranger pawing through my belongings. I peered around the corner into the darkened room, squinting to make out shapes in the gloom. The sounds abruptly stopped. An eerie silence fell over the house. Then I saw it. A dark figure standing motionless in the center of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the shadowy form. It was unnaturally still, as if waiting for something. Suddenly, it lunged towards me with inhuman speed. I stumbled backwards with a strangled cry, my fight-or-flight response kicking into overdrive. The figure slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. I thrashed wildly, desperate to break free of its grip. My hands frantically clawed at empty air as the attacker seemed to vanish into the darkness. Scrambling to my feet, I spun around trying to locate the intruder. To my horror, I realized I was surrounded. More dark figures emerged from the shadows, blocking every exit. They closed in slowly, their features obscured in the gloom. I backed up until I hit the wall, trapped with nowhere to run. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm me, I heard the distant wail of police sirens growing closer. The shadowy figures froze, heads cocked as if listening. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. I slid to the floor, gasping for breath as the adrenaline drained from my body. When the police arrived minutes later, they found no trace of the intruders. The house was completely undisturbed with no signs of forced entry. I spent that night at a friend's house, too shaken to stay alone. In the days that followed, I went over the events again and again in my mind. Had it all been some kind of waking nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? But the bruises on my arms and the lingering sense of dread felt all too real. To this day, I'm not sure what really happened that night. All I know is that I'll never forget the bone-chilling terror of being trapped in my own home, surrounded by those otherworldly shadows. I've since moved to a new place, but I still find myself startling at every creak and bump in the night. The trauma of that experience has left deep scars. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark figures lurking just out of sight. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting to return. Other times, I think maybe I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision or feel an inexplicable chill, and the fear comes rushing back. I've tried therapy, meditation, even home security systems to ease my anxiety. Nothing seems to fully shake the lingering dread. Part of me wonders if I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. I know it may sound crazy, but I can't help feeling like those entities, whatever they were, are still watching me somehow. Like they're biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I find myself obsessively checking locks and peering into dark corners before I can relax. The rational part of my brain tells me it was just a bizarre, one-time occurrence. But late at night, when the house is quiet and still, I'm haunted by vivid memories of those shadowy figures closing in around me. The feeling of utter helplessness and terror is seared into my mind. I've scoured the internet for similar experiences, desperate for some explanation. While I've found plenty of stories about home invasions, nothing quite matches the surreal, almost supernatural quality of what I encountered. It's left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. Some nights, I lie awake imagining what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Would those entities have taken me, hurt me, or simply vanished like they did anyway, leaving me to question my sanity? The not knowing is almost worse than the experience itself. I've considered setting up cameras throughout my house, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything unusual, but part of me is terrified of what I might see. What if those dark figures really are still here, invisible to the naked eye but captured on film? I'm not sure I could handle that confirmation. Friends and family have suggested it was just an extremely vivid nightmare or some kind of sleep paralysis episode. I want to believe them, to have a rational explanation that would ease my fears, but I know in my heart that what I experienced was all too real. The incident has made me hyper-aware of the fragility of our sense of safety and normalcy. In an instant, everything I thought I knew about the world was turned upside down. Now I find myself constantly on edge, wondering what other impossible things might be lurking just beyond our perception. I've started keeping a journal, documenting any unusual occurrences or feelings of unease. Part of me hopes that by tracking these things, I might find some pattern or explanation. But mostly, I think I just need a way to process the lingering trauma and fear. There are moments when I manage to convince myself it was all just a bizarre fluke, a perfect storm of fatigue, stress, and an overactive imagination. But then I'll catch a fleeting shadow out of the corner of my eye or hear an unexplained noise, and I'm right back in that terrifying moment. I know I can't live in fear forever. I'm trying to move on, to reclaim my sense of security and peace of mind. But the memory of those shadowy figures surrounding me in the darkness still haunts my dreams. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the feeling that they could return at any moment. For now, I take it one day at a time. I'm slowly rebuilding my life and trying to find a new normal. But a part of me will always be that terrified person, backed against the wall with nowhere to run, facing the unknown. I just hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone out there who's had a similar experience will know they're not alone. I often wonder if there are others out there who have encountered these shadow beings. Are they some kind of supernatural entities, interdimensional travelers, or just a product of our own fears and imaginations? I may never know the truth, but I'll never stop searching for answers. In the meantime, I've learned to appreciate the moments of peace and normalcy in my life. I try to focus on the present, on the tangible world around me. But always, in the back of my mind, is the knowledge that reality may be far stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. So if you're reading this and you've experienced something similar, know that you're not crazy. There are things in this world that defy explanation. All we can do is support each other and keep searching for the truth, no matter how frightening it may be. Was so excited for our camping trip. 6 of us, me, Jake, Emily, Mike, Olivia, and Chris, had been planning it for weeks. We all needed a break from our stressful jobs and city life, so a weekend in the wilderness sounded perfect. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. It was a beautiful spot deep in the forest, with tall pines surrounding a small clearing. We quickly set up our tents and got a fire going as the sun started to set. The mood was light and fun as we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, laughing and joking around. As night fell, we sat around the crackling fire, swapping stories and looking up at the stars twinkling through the tree branches. It was so peaceful compared to the constant noise of the city. I remember feeling totally relaxed for the first time in months. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I snuggled into my sleeping bag, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I was just drifting off when I heard it, a faint scream in the distance. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, louder this time. A blood-curdling shriek that made my skin crawl. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake whispered from the tent next to mine. "Yeah," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "What was it?" "Probably just an animal," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. We all fell silent, listening intently. For a few minutes, all I could hear was my own pounding heartbeat. Then another scream pierced the night. Closer this time. It was unmistakably human. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight with trembling hands. "Guys, that's not an animal," I hissed. "Should we go check it out?" Chris asked uncertainly. Before anyone could answer, we heard heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush nearby. My blood ran cold. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. "Everyone stay in your tents," Jake ordered in a hushed voice. "Turn off your lights." I clicked off my flashlight, plunging the tent into darkness. I could hear ragged breathing from the other tents as we all tried to stay quiet. The footsteps circled our campsite, crunching on fallen leaves and snapping twigs. My whole body was rigid with fear. Suddenly a beam of light swept across my tent. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. Through the thin fabric, I could see a tall, shadowy figure moving between the trees. It paused near my tent, and I swear I could feel its gaze boring into me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded into the forest. But the night was far from over. The screams continued, sometimes sounding like they were right next to our tents, other times echoing from deep in the woods. It was torture, not knowing what was out there or when it might return. None of us slept a wink. We huddled in our tents, too terrified to make a sound. I've never felt fear like that before, the kind that freezes you in place, makes it hard to breathe. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, the screams finally stopped. We cautiously emerged from our tents, looking around warily. The campsite was a mess. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, and there were strange marks gouged into the trees surrounding us. "Look at this," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was pointing at the ground near the edge of our clearing. We gathered around and saw large, inhuman footprints pressed into the soft earth. They led off into the dense underbrush. That was enough for us. We frantically packed up our gear, not even bothering to properly break down the tents. As we hurried back to our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The drive home was tense and quiet. We were all processing what had happened, trying to make sense of it. But how do you rationalize something like that? It's been months since that camping trip, but I still have nightmares about those screams. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear footsteps circling my house. I've tried to research similar incidents in that area, but I haven't found anything conclusive. Part of me wants answers, but another part is terrified of what I might discover. One thing's for sure, I'm never going camping again. Whatever was out there in those woods that night, it wasn't human, and I have a feeling it's still out there, waiting for its next victims. I don't know if writing this will help me process what happened, or just dredge up more horrific memories. But I needed to share my story to warn others. If you're planning a camping trip, please be careful. There are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes those things find us when we least expect it. I still catch myself looking over my shoulder when I'm outside at night. The rational part of my brain says it was just some sick prank or a wild animal. But deep down, I know better. Whatever hunted us that night was something else entirely, something ancient and evil that should have stayed hidden in the darkest corners of the forest. I've tried talking to my friends about it, but they all seem eager to forget. Jake and Emily broke up shortly after the trip. Mike threw himself into work and barely leaves his apartment anymore. Olivia moved to another state. Chris is the only one who will discuss it, but even he gets uncomfortable when I bring up specifics. Sometimes I wonder if I'm losing my mind. Did it really happen the way I remember? But then I'll catch a glimpse of those inhuman footprints in my dreams, or wake up with the echo of those terrible screams in my ears, and I know it was real. I've become obsessed with researching folklore and cryptids, trying to find some explanation for what we encountered. But nothing quite fits. This was something different, something that doesn't have a name or a place in any book of legends. I find myself drawn back to those woods, even though the thought of returning terrifies me. Part of me needs to know, needs to understand what happened that night. But a larger part knows that going back would be suicide. Whatever is out there, it's waiting. And I don't think it would let me escape a second time. So I'm left with my memories and my fears, always wondering when I might hear those screams again. If you're reading this and planning a camping trip, please be careful. Stick to well-traveled areas. Don't go too deep into the wilderness. And if you hear screams in the night, don't investigate. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that should remain hidden in the darkest parts of the forest. And sometimes those things find us. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint scratching sound coming from my closet. At first, I tried to ignore it, figuring it was probably just a mouse. We'd had issues with rodents in the old dorm building before, but as the minutes ticked by, the scratching grew louder and more insistent. It didn't sound like any mouse I'd ever heard. My heart started racing as the scratching turned into a frantic scrabbling noise. Whatever was in there, it was big. Way too big to be a mouse. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the closet door, afraid to move. Suddenly the noise stopped. The silence was almost worse than the scratching. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a low growl coming from inside the closet. I nearly fell out of my chair. That was definitely not a rodent. My mind raced with possibilities. Had a stray dog somehow gotten into the building and into my room? But how? I knew I needed to investigate, but my legs felt like jelly. Slowly, I stood up and inched towards the closet. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. I screamed and stumbled backwards, tripping over my chair and crashing to the floor. In a flash, a dark figure lunged out of the closet towards me. I scrambled backwards on my hands and feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was humanoid, but moved in a jerky, unnatural way. Its eyes glowed an eerie, yellowish green in the dim light. It came at me again, and I kicked out wildly, my foot connecting with something solid. The creature let out an inhuman shriek that made my blood run cold. I managed to get to my feet and grabbed my desk lamp, wielding it like a weapon. The figure circled me, staying just out of reach. I could hear its ragged breathing and caught glimpses of matted fur or hair. "What are you?" I yelled, my voice shaking. "Get away from me!" It lunged again, and I swung the lamp, smashing it across the creature's head. There was a sickening crack, and it crumpled to the floor. For a moment I thought it was over. Then the thing started twitching and convulsing. To my horror, its body began to shift and change shape before my eyes. In seconds, it had completely vanished, leaving no trace behind. I stood there in shock, lamp still clutched in my trembling hands. What the hell just happened? Had I imagined the whole thing? A scratching sound from behind made me whirl around. My blood turned to ice as I saw multiple pairs of glowing eyes peering out from the shadows in every corner of the room. More of the creatures were emerging, blocking the door, my only escape route. I was surrounded. Panic seized me as the creatures closed in. This was it. I was going to die here, torn apart by these things, whatever they were. Just as the nearest creature tensed to spring, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside, the night security guard making his rounds. In an instant, all of the creatures vanished into thin air. The room was suddenly, impossibly empty. I stood there frozen, unable to process what I'd just experienced. When the security guard knocked on my door to check on the noise, I couldn't even form words to respond. He found me huddled in the corner, shaking and babbling incoherently. The next few days passed in a blur. The police were called, but found no evidence of any break-in or disturbance. My room was exactly as it had been, aside from the shattered lamp. I was sent to the campus counselor, who gently suggested that stress and sleep deprivation had caused me to have an extremely vivid hallucination or waking nightmare. Part of me wanted to believe that explanation, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. Those creatures were in my room. They were going to kill me. And for some reason, they fled at the approach of another human presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far more sinister than I could comprehend. Some supernatural force had targeted me that night, and I had no idea why. I left campus as soon as I could, making up an excuse about a family emergency. I haven't been back since. I transferred to another school closer to home and moved back in with my parents. It's been months, but I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the darkness. I sleep with the lights on now. I can't stand to be alone in the dark. Sometimes I wonder if those creatures are still out there, waiting. If they'll come for me again someday. All I know is that I'm never staying alone in a dorm room at night ever again. I don't think I'd survive a second encounter. I still don't understand what happened that night or why I was targeted. But I'm grateful to be alive and determined to never experience anything like that again. Whatever those things were, I hope they stay far away from me for the rest of my life. The park was eerily quiet as I started my usual route. The lampposts cast long shadows across the path, and a thin layer of frost crunched beneath my feet. At first the solitude was comforting, just me, my thoughts, and the rhythm of my footsteps. About 15 minutes in, something changed. I can't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 100 times more intense. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a dark figure, barely visible in the shadows. I turned my head for a better look, but it was gone. My heart started racing, and not just from the exercise. I picked up my pace, trying to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other nocturnal animal. But deep down, I knew better. As I rounded the next bend, I saw it again. This time, it was closer. A tall, dark silhouette, keeping pace with me from just inside the tree line. Panic set in. I was being followed, hunted even. My mind raced through all the horror stories I'd heard about joggers being attacked in parks. Why hadn't I listened to my friends when they told me it wasn't safe to run alone at night? I broke into a sprint, my lungs burning in the frigid air, but no matter how fast I ran, the figure kept up. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding between the trees without a sound. I could feel its eyes on me, predatory and relentless. The path seemed endless. Every turn looked the same in the darkness. I was lost, disoriented, and terrified. My legs were on fire, but fear kept me going. I knew if I stopped, even for a second, it would be over. As I ran, I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help. But my trembling fingers couldn't unlock the screen. I nearly dropped it, managing to catch it at the last second. Those few seconds of distraction were all it took. When I looked up, the figure was on the path ahead of me. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. In the dim light, I could make out a tall, lean form. But its face, God, its face was hidden in shadow, 2 pinpricks of light where eyes should be. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, no longer caring about finding my way out. I just needed to get away. Branches whipped at my face as I veered off the path, crashing through the underbrush. I could hear it behind me, moving much faster than any human should be able to. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline pushed me back to my feet. I limped forward, knowing I was done for. That's when I saw it, the park entrance. Somehow, in my blind panic, I'd found my way back. With one last burst of energy, I sprinted towards the street. My lungs felt like they were going to explode. I could feel it right behind me, so close I was sure I'd feel its grip on my shoulder at any moment. I burst out onto the sidewalk, the streetlights nearly blinding me after the darkness of the park. I collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for air. When I finally managed to look back, my blood ran cold. It stood there, right at the edge of the park, motionless, watching. Those pinprick eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to scream. But I couldn't make a sound. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, as a car approached, it melted back into the shadows, just gone, like it had never been there at all. I don't know how long I sat there on the cold ground, shaking and trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I managed to call a friend to pick me up. I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. How could I? It sounded insane, even to me. It's been weeks, and I still can't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, and too many late-night horror movies. But deep down, I know what I saw. Needless to say, I don't run at night anymore. Hell, I can barely bring myself to go to the park in broad daylight. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves sets my heart racing. I keep thinking I'll see those eyes again, watching me from the darkness. I don't know what it was that chased me that night. A person? Something else? All I know is that I came closer to something terrible than I ever want to again. So if you're thinking about a late-night run in the park, take it from me. Stick to the treadmill. Some things are better left in the shadows. We set out late in the evening after work, figuring we'd arrive at the cabin around midnight. As we drove further into the wilderness, the roads became increasingly desolate. Soon we were winding through dark forests on narrow, icy roads with no other cars in sight. Emily was dozing in the passenger seat as I focused intently on the treacherous road ahead. The headlights barely illuminated the path through the thick blanket of snow. An uneasy feeling began to creep over me. We were completely isolated out here. Suddenly, my heart leapt into my throat. There, in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights, was a group of shadowy figures. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as we skidded to a stop about 20 feet away from them. "What's going on?" Emily jolted awake, looking around in confusion. "There's people in the road," I said, my voice tight with tension. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out 5 or 6 individuals standing motionless, blocking our path. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothing and seemed to be staring directly at us. A chill ran down my spine. Something felt very wrong about this. "Maybe they need help," Emily suggested nervously. But as I looked closer at their faces, my blood ran cold. Their expressions were blank, emotionless, but their eyes held a predatory glint that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Lock the doors," I whispered urgently to Emily. She quickly complied as I weighed our options. We were trapped. There was no way to turn around on the narrow road, and these people were blocking our only path forward. Slowly, I rolled down my window just a crack. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything all right? Do you need assistance?" No response. They just continued to stare, unblinking. "Please move aside so we can pass," I tried again, a note of desperation creeping into my voice. That's when they started moving towards us. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Emily let out a small whimper of fear beside me. As they got closer, I could see that their clothes were filthy and torn. Their skin was deathly pale, almost gray in the harsh glare of the headlights. "Start the car," Emily urged in a panicked whisper. "We need to get out of here." I turned the key in the ignition, but to my horror the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered frantically, trying again and again to start it as the figures got closer and closer. They surrounded the car, their dead eyes peering in at us from every window. I could see now that their faces were gaunt and haggard, with dark circles under their eyes. One of them pressed his face right up against my window, his rotten breath fogging up the glass. Suddenly, they began pounding on the car. The whole vehicle shook as they beat their fists against the metal and glass. Emily was sobbing now, curled up in her seat with her hands over her ears. I was frozen in terror, unable to think or move. The pounding grew more intense. I saw a hairline crack starting to form in the windshield. It was only a matter of time before they broke through. In that moment, I was certain we were going to die. Just when all hope seemed lost, I saw a flicker of light in the rearview mirror. Headlights! Another car was approaching. As suddenly as it had begun, the assault on our car stopped. I whipped my head around, hardly daring to believe it. The figures were scattering, melting away into the darkness of the surrounding forest like they had never been there at all. Within seconds, they had vanished completely. An old pickup truck pulled up beside us, and a grizzled-looking man leaned out the window. "You folks all right?" he called out. "Saw you stopped in the middle of the road here." I rolled down my window, still shaking. There were people," I stammered. "They attacked our car. They just disappeared when you showed up." The man's brow furrowed. "Ain't seen nobody else on this road all night," he said. "You sure you weren't seeing things? These mountain roads can play tricks on you." I opened my mouth to protest, but then closed it again. How could I explain what had just happened? It all seemed so surreal now. "Our car won't start," I said instead. "Could you help us?" The kind stranger ended up jump-starting our car and then escorting us to the nearest town. Emily and I were too shaken to continue to the cabin, so we got a room at a small motel instead. We barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. In the light of day, we examined the car but found no evidence of the attack. No dents, no cracks in the glass. If it weren't for the vivid shared memory, I might have thought it was all a bizarre dream. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. Who were those people? What did they want? How did they vanish so quickly? The questions haunt me still. All I know is that I'll never forget those dead eyes staring in at us, or how close we came to God knows what fate. Emily and I don't talk about it much, but I know she still has nightmares too. We've never taken another trip to the mountains since then. Some experiences change you forever, leaving you with a bone-deep knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I just hope I never encounter anything like that again. At first, the silence was comforting. The streets were empty, streetlights casting long shadows across lawns dusted with frost. My footsteps echoed softly as I made my way down the sidewalk. The familiar houses of my neighborhood looked different at night, darker, more mysterious. I'd walked about 3 blocks when I first felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I glanced behind me but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just empty streets stretching into darkness. I shook it off and continued walking. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. My breath quickened, forming little clouds in the frigid air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the nighttime shadows were playing tricks on my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that eyes were watching me from the darkness. At the next corner, I heard it, the soft scuff of a footstep behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the shadows between 2 houses, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. My palms were sweating despite the cold as I picked up my pace. The soft footsteps continued, always just out of sight. Sometimes they seemed to fade, only to suddenly sound much closer. I was afraid to look back again, terrified of what I might see. As I hurried down the sidewalk, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the street, a figure dressed all in black darted between two parked cars. My blood ran cold. It was following me, keeping pace from the other side of the road. I broke into a jog, no longer trying to hide my fear. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. Ahead, I saw the figure in black duck behind a tree. When it emerged, it was somehow closer than before. Panic rising in my throat, I started to run. The quiet neighborhood erupted with the sound of pounding feet, mine and those of my pursuer. I chanced to look over my shoulder and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was there, a fluid shadow gliding after me with inhuman grace. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague human shape, darker than the night around it. I sprinted the last block to my house, lungs burning in the icy air. Fumbling with my keys, I got the door open and slammed it behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, straining to hear any sound from outside. For several long moments, there was only silence. Then, soft footsteps approached the porch. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, afraid even the slightest sound would give me away. Something scraped lightly against the wood of the door, as if testing it. Unable to bear the suspense, I crept to the window and peeked out through a gap in the curtains. The porch was empty. I scanned the yard and the street beyond, but there was no sign of my pursuer. It had vanished as quickly and silently as it had appeared. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every creak and shadow. When dawn finally broke, I searched the yard for footprints or any other sign of what had happened. But the frost-covered grass was undisturbed. There was no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head, a product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen and heard was real. Something had stalked me through the quiet streets of my neighborhood that night. I've never taken another late-night walk. The memory of those footsteps and that shadowy figure are burned into my mind. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the night thinking I hear soft footsteps outside my window. And on the darkest nights, when I look out at the street, I swear I can see a deeper patch of shadow lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlights, waiting. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know why it followed me or what it wanted. But I do know this. Something hunts in the darkness of my neighborhood, and I fear that one night it will come for me again. The experience has left me permanently on edge. I've installed extra locks on all my doors and windows. I keep the curtains drawn at night and jump at unexpected noises. My neighbors have noticed the change in me, but I can't bring myself to explain. They wouldn't believe me anyway. Sometimes I wonder if others in the neighborhood have had similar encounters. I've started paying closer attention to local news and neighborhood gossip, looking for any hint that someone else might have seen the shadow figure. So far, I haven't found anything concrete, but there have been whispers, reports of pets going missing, strange noises in the night, glimpses of movement just at the edge of vision. I've thought about moving, but the idea of starting over somewhere new is daunting. And who's to say it wouldn't follow me? No, for better or worse, this is my home. I just have to learn to live with the knowledge that something sinister lurks in the shadows. The worst part is the not knowing. What was it? Why did it chase me? What would have happened if it had caught me? The questions gnaw at me, keeping me up at night. I've researched local folklore and urban legends, looking for anything that might explain what I encountered. But nothing quite fits. Some nights, when sleep eludes me, I find myself drawn to the window. I'll stand there for hours, peering out into the darkness, both dreading and hoping to catch another glimpse of the shadow figure. Part of me wants proof that I'm not crazy, that what I experienced was real, but a larger part hopes I never see it again. I know I can never fully relax in my own neighborhood again. Every walk to the mailbox, every trip to my car is tinged with anxiety. I'm constantly scanning my surroundings, looking for any sign of movement in the shadows. The carefree sense of security I once felt is gone, replaced by a constant, low-level dread. Friends have suggested therapy, thinking my changed behavior is due to stress or anxiety. How can I explain that my fear is entirely rational, that there really is something out there in the night, something that defies explanation? I've learned to keep my experience to myself, but the weight of the secret is hard to bear. As I write this, the sun is setting. Soon, darkness will fall over the neighborhood, and like every night, I'll double-check the locks, draw the curtains tight, and try to convince myself that I'm safe. But I know the truth. Something is out there, waiting in the shadows, and I can't shake the feeling that one day it will come for me again. The memory of that night haunts me still, the sound of footsteps echoing mine, the glimpses of a dark figure always just out of clear sight, the heart-pounding terror of the chase. It's all seared into my mind. I replay the events over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have confronted or escaped the entity more effectively. I've become somewhat of an insomniac since that night. When I do sleep, my dreams are filled with endless dark streets and the sensation of being pursued by something I can't quite see. I often wake in a cold sweat, convinced I've heard footsteps outside my window. The experience has changed how I view my neighborhood and my neighbors. Every person I pass on the street becomes a potential threat. Is that really my elderly neighbor out for a stroll, or is it something sinister wearing a familiar face? The rational part of my mind knows these fears are unfounded, but I can't help the surge of adrenaline every time I encounter someone after dark. I've taken to studying the layout of my neighborhood obsessively, memorizing every possible route home, every potential hiding spot or escape path. I've even started carrying a small flashlight and a personal alarm, though I'm not sure they'd be any use against whatever it was that chased me that night. The internet has become both a blessing and a curse. I spend hours scouring forums and websites, looking for similar experiences or explanations for what I encountered. I found a few stories that seem to parallel mine, but nothing conclusive. Sometimes I wonder if sharing my story online might attract the attention of others who've had similar encounters. But then I worry, what if it also attracts the attention of the thing itself? As the months have passed, I've started to question everything about that night. Was the figure really as inhuman as I remember, or has my mind exaggerated its otherworldly qualities? Could it have been a very dedicated stalker or prankster? But then I remember the way it moved, the impossible speed and silence, and I know it was something beyond normal explanation. I've developed a keen interest in home security systems and have gradually turned my house into a fortress. Cameras cover every angle of the exterior. Motion-sensitive lights illuminate the yard at night, and I've even installed a panic room. My friends think I'm paranoid, but they don't understand the terror of knowing something out there might be watching, waiting for another opportunity. Despite my fears, there's a part of me that almost wants another encounter, not out of bravery, but out of a desperate need for validation. I want proof that I'm not crazy, that what I experienced was real, but then I remind myself of the bone-deep terror of that night, and I pray that I never see the shadow figure again. As I finish writing this, I realize that putting my experience into words has been somewhat cathartic. It doesn't change what happened or ease my fears about what might still be out there, but it feels good to finally express it all. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to share this story more widely. For now, though, I'll continue to watch and wait, always aware that in the shadows of my quiet neighborhood, something unknowable may be watching back. I hadn't seen another car or any signs of civilization for hours. The inky blackness seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by the narrow tunnel of my headlights. Just as I was starting to panic about running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, I spotted a faint glow on the horizon. As I got closer, I made out the flickering neon sign of a small gas station. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the dimly lit lot. It was one of those old-school stations with just a couple of pumps and a tiny convenience store. The buzzing fluorescent lights cast an eerie pallor over everything. As I got out to fill up, a gust of frigid wind cut right through my jacket, making me shiver. That's when I got my first inkling that something wasn't right. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement in the shadows beyond the light of the gas pumps. I whipped my head around, but saw nothing there. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of my neck that I was being watched. As I started pumping gas, I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching on gravel, coming from the darkness behind the station. My heart started racing. I peered into the gloom, but couldn't make anything out. The footsteps stopped. An oppressive silence fell, broken only by the mechanical clicking of the gas pump. I tried to focus on filling my tank, but found myself compulsively glancing around, searching the shadows. That's when I saw it. A dark figure standing motionless at the edge of the light, half hidden behind a dumpster. I blinked, and it was gone. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. With trembling hands, I finished pumping and screwed the gas cap back on. I debated whether to go inside the store to pay, not wanting to leave the relative safety of my car again. But the sign said cash only, so I had no choice. As I walked towards the store entrance, I heard those footsteps again, closer this time. I spun around and caught a glimpse of someone, or something, ducking behind my car. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but forced myself to keep walking calmly to the store, my legs feeling like jelly. The store was deserted except for a bored-looking clerk reading a magazine behind the counter. As I fumbled for cash with shaking hands, I asked him if he had seen anyone else outside. He barely looked up as he grunted, "Nope." I hurried back outside, keys clutched like a weapon between my fingers. The lot appeared empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move. I practically dove into my car, locking the doors immediately. As I went to start the engine, movement in my rearview mirror caught my eye. My blood ran cold. There was a figure standing directly behind my car, so close I should have hit them when I backed in. But I hadn't seen anyone there before. They were unnaturally tall and thin, clothed all in black. But what made my heart stop was their face, or rather, lack of one. Where features should have been was just a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of there, tires squealing. In my mirror, I saw the figure slowly raise one impossibly long arm, as if waving goodbye. Then it melted back into the shadows. I drove like a maniac for hours, too terrified to stop. Every time I blinked, I saw that faceless figure burned into my eyelids. Eventually dawn broke, and some of the blind panic began to subside. I convinced myself I must have been hallucinating from exhaustion. There was no way what I saw could have been real. I managed to put the incident out of my mind for months. Then one day, I came across a news article that made my blood run cold. There had been a brutal murder at that very gas station just a few weeks after my visit. A traveler had been found butchered behind the dumpsters. Security camera footage showed a tall, thin figure in black stalking the victim. But when police tried to get a clear shot of the killer's face, the images were always distorted or blurred. The realization of how close I came to being that poor traveler's fate hit me like a physical blow. To this day, I'm haunted by questions. Who or what was that figure? Why did it let me go when it clearly had me in its sights? Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can see that blank face watching me from the shadows. I don't drive long distances at night anymore if I can help it, and I certainly never stop at isolated gas stations. The memory of that night is seared into my brain forever. The bitter cold, the oppressive darkness, and the nameless terror of being stalked by something not quite human. I thank my lucky stars I made it out alive, but a part of me will always wonder, what if I hadn't? I set out around 8 p.m., bundled up in layers against the chill. My bike lights illuminated the road ahead as I pedaled out of town and onto the rural back roads. The first hour or so was blissful, just me, my bike, and the open road stretching into the darkness. But as I ventured further from civilization, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The shadows seemed to deepen and close in around my small circle of light. An icy wind picked up, rustling through the bare trees that lined the road. I shivered and picked up my pace. It wasn't until I reached an unfamiliar intersection that I realized with a jolt of fear that I was lost. I must have made a wrong turn somewhere along the way. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Panic started to set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. Alone on a pitch-black country road with no idea where I was or how to get back. I chose a direction at random and started pedaling, hoping I'd eventually come across a landmark or sign I recognized. But as the minutes ticked by with no change in the empty landscape, my anxiety grew. The beam of my headlight seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness pressing in. Every shadow looked menacing. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel behind me. I whipped my head around, heart pounding. There were two men walking a short distance behind my bike. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel the intensity of their stares boring into me. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I faced forward again and pedaled faster, hoping it was just a coincidence. But when I glanced back, they had sped up too, matching my pace. There was no doubt now. They were following me. My breath came in ragged gasps as panic took hold. Who were they? What did they want? I was completely alone out here with no way to call for help. I pushed myself to go even faster, legs burning with the effort. But no matter how hard I pedaled, I couldn't shake them. Their footsteps seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder. I could practically feel their breath on the back of my neck. Tears of terror stung my eyes as I realized I couldn't outrun them forever. My legs were already trembling with exhaustion. The rational part of my brain knew I should conserve energy, but blind fear drove me to keep pushing harder. My lungs felt like they were on fire. Sweat poured down my face despite the frigid air. I was so focused on the sounds behind me that I nearly missed the pinprick of light that appeared on the horizon. At first I thought I was hallucinating from fear and fatigue, but as I drew closer, I realized it was real. A warm yellow glow coming from what looked like a farmhouse in the distance. It was still far off, but it ignited a desperate spark of hope in my chest. If I could just make it there, maybe I'd find help. With one last surge of adrenaline, I stood up on the pedals and rode harder than I ever had in my life. The light grew larger, and I could make out the silhouette of a 2-story farmhouse. Please let someone be awake, I prayed silently. I skidded into the gravel driveway, nearly falling off my bike in my haste. I abandoned it and sprinted the last few yards to the porch, pounding frantically on the door. "Help! Please, someone help me!" I yelled between gasping breaths. Long seconds ticked by with no response. I looked over my shoulder, fully expecting to see my pursuers closing in, but the driveway behind me was empty. Had I imagined the whole thing? Just as despair started to set in, I heard the click of a lock. The door creaked open to reveal an older man in flannel pajamas, looking confused and concerned. "What in tarnation is going on out here?" he asked. The flood of relief was so overwhelming, I nearly collapsed. Through heaving sobs, I managed to choke out some garbled explanation about getting lost and being chased. The farmer ushered me inside, sat me down at his kitchen table, and pressed a steaming mug of coffee into my shaking hands. As the heat and caffeine worked their magic, my frantic breathing slowly steadied. The farmer's wife appeared, wrapping a quilt around my shoulders. They listened patiently as I recounted my harrowing experience. "You're safe now," the farmer reassured me. "We don't get many visitors out this way, especially not at this hour. You're welcome to stay the night, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction come morning." I gratefully accepted their offer, beyond thankful for their kindness. As I settled onto their well-worn couch for the night, exhaustion finally overcame the lingering adrenaline. But even as my eyes drifted shut, I couldn't shake the feeling of those intense stares boring into me from the darkness. The next morning, the farmer drove me back to town in his rusty pickup truck. In the light of day, with my bike secured in the truck bed, the events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike. Had I really been in such danger, or had my imagination run wild in the dark? I never did figure out who those men were or why they were following me. Maybe they were just fellow travelers on the road and my fear twisted their intentions into something sinister. Or maybe I narrowly escaped a truly horrifying fate. Either way, I learned my lesson about venturing too far from familiar territory, especially after dark. These days I stick to well-lit paths closer to home. But on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I still feel a chill run down my spine as I remember those footsteps echoing behind me in the darkness. It started off normal enough. I was mopping the food court floors around 2 a.m. when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just a spilled drink, but as I got closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was blood. Not a lot, just a few small drops, but unmistakably blood. My heart started racing as I followed the trail. It led out of the food court and down one of the main corridors. The mall was eerily quiet at that hour, just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As I walked, the blood drops got larger and more frequent. Whatever was bleeding, it was bleeding a lot. The trail took me past darkened storefronts, their mannequins casting creepy shadows. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me, but it was just me and the blood. I debated calling security, but I wanted to see where this led first. In hindsight, that was incredibly stupid of me. After what felt like forever, the trail ended at a maintenance closet tucked away in a back hallway. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but morbid curiosity pushed me forward. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. The smell hit me first, that awful coppery scent of blood mixed with something even fouler. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a crumpled form on the floor. It was a man, or what was left of one. His throat had been torn open and his chest, God, his chest was ripped to shreds. I'd never seen so much blood in my life. I stumbled backwards, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in suburban shopping malls. As I tried to process the horrific scene, movement in the shadows caught my eye. Before I could react, a dark figure lunged at me from the back of the closet. It slammed into me with incredible force, knocking me to the ground. I caught a glimpse of wild eyes and razor-sharp teeth as it pinned me down. This thing, it wasn't human. Its skin was a sickly gray color, and it reeked of decay. I struggled against it, but it was inhumanly strong. Clawed hands wrapped around my throat as it tried to drag me back into the closet. I thrashed and kicked, fighting for my life. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I started to lose consciousness. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. Suddenly there was a shout, and the creature's grip loosened. I gasped for air as its weight was thrown off me. Through blurry eyes, I saw one of the night security guards grappling with the thing. There was a sickening crack, and the guard went flying into the wall. I scrambled to my feet, ready to run, but the guard yelled at me to help him. Against every survival instinct, I turned back. The creature was on top of the guard now, claws slashing. Without thinking, I grabbed a mop from my cart and swung it as hard as I could at the thing's head. It connected with a thud, and the creature stumbled back, momentarily stunned. The guard took advantage and tackled it, trying to restrain its arms. "The closet!" he shouted at me between grunts of exertion. "Close the damn door!" I dove for the door, slamming it shut just as the creature broke free. There was a furious howl, and the door shuddered as it threw itself against it. The guard and I braced ourselves against it, holding on for dear life as the thing on the other side raged. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the pounding stopped. We waited in tense silence, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, the guard motioned for me to step back. He pulled out his gun and slowly opened the door. The closet was empty. No dead body, no blood, no monster. It was like nothing had ever happened. We searched every inch, but there was no trace of the horror we'd just experienced. The guard, Tom was his name, looked as shell-shocked as I felt. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom shook his head. "I don't know. I've worked security here for 15 years and never seen anything like it. But I know what I saw, and that wasn't human." We reported the incident, of course, but with no evidence there wasn't much to be done. The official story was that we'd had a shared hallucination, maybe from a gas leak or something. But I know what I experienced was real. I quit that job the next day. No amount of money was worth going through that again. Tom stayed on, but I hear he requested a transfer to day shift. I don't blame him one bit. It's been 3 months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. The doctors say it's PTSD, and maybe that's part of it. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that can't be explained, dark things lurking in the shadows, and sometimes those things find their way into our safe, normal lives. I don't go to malls anymore. The bright lights and cheery music feel like a facade now, hiding untold horrors. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. Because I know that monsters are real, and they could be anywhere. To this day, I have no idea what that creature was or where it came from. Was it some kind of demon? A science experiment gone wrong? Or something even worse that we don't have a name for? All I know is that it was pure evil, and it's still out there somewhere. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has encountered it. Are there other stories out there of mysterious attacks in that mall? Did that thing find more victims? The thought keeps me up at night. I've tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night haunts me. The sheer terror I felt, the certainty that I was about to die, it never really leaves you. I find myself obsessively researching paranormal phenomena, looking for any explanation of what I saw. There are moments when I almost convince myself it wasn't real, that it was all just a vivid nightmare or a stress-induced hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of the scars on my neck where that thing's claws dug in, and I know it really happened. I often think about Tom and wonder if he's okay. Has he seen that creature again? Does he lie awake at night reliving that moment like I do? I want to reach out to him, but I'm afraid of stirring up those memories again. The hardest part is not being able to talk about it. Who would believe me? I'd sound like a raving lunatic, so I keep it bottled up inside, letting it eat away at me. Writing this is the first time I've really told the full story. If you're reading this, please be careful out there. The world is full of unexplained dangers. That ordinary place you visit every day could be hiding unimaginable horrors. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and never investigate strange noises alone. As for me, I'm trying to rebuild my life. I've got a new job now, working days at a small office. No more night shifts for me. I've started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma. It helps, but I know I'll never fully get over what happened. I still find myself drawn to that mall sometimes. I'll drive by, half expecting to see some sign of that creature. But it always looks perfectly normal. Shoppers coming and going, oblivious to the evil that once walked those halls. Part of me wants to go back inside, to prove to myself that I can face my fears. But a bigger part knows that would be insanely dangerous. What if that thing is still there, waiting in the shadows? No, it's better to stay away. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened that night. Maybe it's better not to know. All I can do is try to move forward and hope that somehow, someday, I'll be able to feel safe again. So that's my story. Believe it or don't. But I swear every word is true. And if you ever find yourself working a late shift in a deserted mall, just remember, you might not be as alone as you think. I was working as a delivery driver for a local courier company, and it was just another ordinary day on the job. I had a bunch of packages to deliver to various addresses in the rural outskirts of town. The area was pretty remote, with winding country roads and dense forests. I'd made deliveries out there before, but never to this particular address. As I drove deeper into the countryside, following the GPS directions, the roads got narrower and more overgrown. The trees seemed to close in on either side, branches scraping against the sides of my van. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this place felt off. After about an hour of driving, I realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The GPS was going haywire, the signal cutting in and out. I pulled over to try and get my bearings, peering at the crumpled paper map I kept as a backup. That's when I noticed a small dirt road leading off into the woods that I hadn't seen before. It looked barely wide enough for my van, but the address I was looking for was supposedly down that way. Against my better judgment, I decided to try it. I figured I could always turn around if it was a dead end. As I inched down the rutted path, the trees seemed to press in even closer. Branches scratched at the windows like bony fingers. The sky had gotten overcast, casting everything in a gloomy gray light. After a few minutes, the road opened up into a small clearing. What I saw made me slam on the brakes. There, nestled in the woods, was a tiny village that looked like it had been frozen in time for 100 years. Ramshackle wooden houses with sagging roofs lined a single dirt street. There were no cars, no power lines, nothing modern at all. It was like I'd stumbled across some old pioneer settlement that had been forgotten by the outside world. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be right. There was no way a place like this still existed out here, completely cut off from civilization. Yet here it was, right in front of me. Telling myself I must have made a mistake, I decided to ask for directions and then get the hell out of there. I grabbed my phone to call my boss, but of course there was no signal. Great. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the van. The silence was eerie, no birds, no wind, just dead quiet. My footsteps on the packed dirt seemed deafeningly loud. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone home? I'm looking for directions." No response. The houses remained dark and still, but as I walked further into the village, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed movement in one of the windows, just a quick flash, like someone ducking out of sight. I whirled around, heart pounding. Another flicker of movement in a different house, and another. "Hey!" I shouted, fear creeping into my voice. "I can see you in there. I just need some help with directions and then I'll be on my way." Still no response, but now I could hear sounds coming from inside the houses. Creaking floorboards, muffled whispers, the shuffling of many feet. Panic started to set in. This was wrong, so wrong. I needed to get out of here now. I turned to sprint back to my van, but froze in my tracks. Standing between me and my only escape were three figures. They were dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes that looked a century out of date. Their skin was pale and waxy, with a grayish tinge that didn't look quite human. And their eyes, God, their eyes were pitch black, like empty sockets. I stumbled backwards, a scream caught in my throat. More figures were emerging from the houses now, moving with an unnatural, shambling gait. Their faces were blank and expressionless, but those horrible black eyes were all fixed on me. Terror propelled me into action. I bolted down a narrow alley between two houses, praying there was another way out of this nightmarish place. I could hear them behind me, their shuffling footsteps and rasping breaths getting closer. I emerged on the other side of the village, my lungs burning. To my horror, I saw that the dirt road I'd come in on was gone, just solid forest in every direction. How was that possible? There was no time to question it. I plunged into the woods, branches whipping at my face as I ran blindly. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Inhuman shrieks and howls echoed through the trees. I don't know how long I ran. My legs felt like lead. Each breath was agony, but the mind-numbing terror kept me going. I knew that if those things caught me, I was dead, or worse. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line onto a paved road. A real, modern road. I nearly wept with relief. Headlights appeared in the distance. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt inches from me. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the driver's window. "Please, you have to help me." The startled driver, an older man, rolled down his window. "What in the world? Are you all right, son?" I babbled out my story, glancing fearfully back at the woods. But there was no sign of pursuit now, just quiet, normal-looking forest. The man clearly thought I was either crazy or on drugs, but he agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see those pallid faces and black eyes emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. I filed a police report, but of course they found no trace of the village. The dirt road I'd turned down didn't exist on any maps. I've been back to that area multiple times since then, searching for any sign of what I saw, but I've never been able to find that clearing again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the job and long hours driving alone finally made me crack. But then I remember those inhuman eyes, the soul-chilling terror I felt, and I know it was real. I quit my job as a delivery driver after that. I can't handle being out in remote areas alone anymore. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that village, about being chased through those woods by things that should not exist. I don't know what would have happened if that car hadn't come along when it did, and part of me never wants to find out. So if you're ever driving through the countryside and come across a dirt road that isn't on any map, my advice is this: keep driving. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because there are things out there in the dark woods that are better left undiscovered, things that should remain hidden from the world of the living. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. The road was dark and empty, winding through dense forest. My headlights barely penetrated the gloom. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show providing background noise to keep me awake. As I rounded a bend, I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure sitting in my back seat. My heart nearly stopped. I jerked the wheel in surprise and the car swerved dangerously before I regained control. Gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, I forced myself to look in the mirror again. Nothing. The back seat was empty. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. It must have been a trick of the light, I told myself. The rain and darkness playing tricks on my tired mind. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. As I continued driving, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every few minutes I'd steal another glance in the mirror, half expecting to see someone there. But each time, there was nothing but darkness. I turned up the radio, hoping the voices would drown out my paranoid thoughts. But even over the music and rain, I could have sworn I heard the soft sound of breathing coming from behind me. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "There's no one there." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The feeling of a presence was overwhelming. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement in the back seat. When I whipped my head around to look, there was nothing there. My palms were sweating now as I gripped the wheel. Every shadow seemed menacing. The trees looming on either side of the road felt like they were closing in. I pressed down harder on the accelerator, eager to get home as quickly as possible. That's when I saw it again in the mirror, unmistakable this time. A dark figure hunched in the middle of the back seat. I could make out the vague outline of a head and shoulders. My blood ran cold. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing on the wet pavement. The car fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop. Heart pounding, I spun around in my seat. The back seat was empty. "What the hell is going on?" I said out loud, my voice shaky. Part of me wanted to get out and check the whole car, but I was too terrified to leave the relative safety of the driver's seat. Instead, I took several deep breaths, trying to calm myself. "You're exhausted and seeing things," I told myself firmly. "There's no one in the car. You're alone." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The feeling of another presence was too strong to ignore. With trembling hands, I put the car back in drive and continued down the road. I drove well above the speed limit, taking the curves too fast. All I wanted was to get home as quickly as possible. But it felt like the road went on forever, twisting endlessly through the dark forest. Every few seconds, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Sometimes it was empty, but other times I caught glimpses of that shadowy figure. It seemed to flicker in and out of existence, there one moment and gone the next. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my coat hanging in the back seat, or a bag I'd forgotten about. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever was in my car with me wasn't something that could be explained away so easily. As I drove, I became aware of a soft whispering sound. At first I thought it was just the wind or rain, but it grew louder until I could almost make out words. The sound seemed to be coming from right behind my ear. I jerked away, pressing myself against the driver's side door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" No response. Just that soft, unintelligible whispering. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone. But who would I call? What would I even say? I could imagine how crazy I would sound trying to explain this to anyone. As I rounded another bend, my headlights illuminated a sign. My exit was coming up. Relief flooded through me. I was almost home. Just a few more minutes and I'd be safe. But as I took the exit ramp, the whispering grew louder. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure more clearly than ever before. It was definitely humanoid in shape, but with features obscured by shadow. As I watched, it seemed to lean forward slightly. I let out a strangled cry and floored the accelerator. The engine roared as I sped down familiar streets, heedless of stop signs and speed limits. All I cared about was getting home. Finally, blessedly, I screeched into my driveway. I threw the car into park and fumbled with my seatbelt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely undo it. Without looking back, I flung open the door and ran for my house. It wasn't until I was inside with the door locked behind me that I allowed myself to breathe. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, my legs trembling. After a few minutes, I gathered my courage and peeked out the window. My car sat in the driveway, looking perfectly normal. There was no sign of anything unusual. Part of me wanted to just go to bed and pretend the whole thing had never happened, but I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I checked. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed a flashlight and went back outside. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle. I approached my car cautiously, shining the flashlight beam through the windows. The back seat was empty. I opened all the doors and checked every inch of the interior. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been in there besides me. I went back inside, locking the door securely behind me. Logic told me that I must have imagined the whole thing. I was tired. It was dark and rainy, the perfect conditions for an overactive imagination to run wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd experienced was real. The terror I'd felt was too visceral, too immediate to have been purely imaginary. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in bed, every light in the house blazing, jumping at every little sound. Even now, weeks later, I still feel uneasy every time I get in my car. I check the back seat obsessively before driving anywhere. I don't know what happened to me that night. I don't know if it was some kind of hallucination, a ghostly encounter, or something else entirely. But I do know that I'll never forget the overwhelming feeling of a presence in my car, watching me, whispering to me as I drove through the darkness. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I still catch myself glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again. So far, it hasn't reappeared, but I can't shake the feeling that it's out there somewhere, waiting. And I dread the day I might look in my mirror and see it sitting there once more. I set out around 9 p.m. as usual, my headphones in, enjoying the crisp fall air. About 15 minutes in, I noticed another runner behind me on the path. No big deal, I thought. Plenty of people run at night. But as I continued along my usual route, taking the winding trails through the wooded areas, I realized the runner was still there. Every time I glanced back, I could see their shadowy figure maybe 50 yards behind me. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. It's a popular running spot after all. But something felt off. The way they matched my pace exactly, speeding up when I did, slowing when I slowed. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling, focusing on my music and the sound of my feet hitting the ground. After about 30 minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. This person was definitely following me. My heart started to race as I realized how isolated we were in the darkening park. I picked up my pace, veering off my usual path to take a shortcut. But when I looked back, they were still there, keeping the same distance. Panic started to set in. I took off my headphones, straining to hear if they were getting closer. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and pounding heartbeat. The park lamps cast long shadows across the path. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. I sprinted toward a more open area, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed effortlessly. It was like they knew exactly where I was going to go. My lungs were burning, but terror kept me running. I headed for the steep hill that overlooks the duck pond, thinking I could get a better view of my pursuer from up there. As I climbed, my legs felt like lead. At the top, I finally stopped, gasping for air. I spun around, ready to confront whoever it was, but there was no one there. The path behind me was completely empty. I scanned the whole area, my eyes straining in the dim light. Nothing. No sign of the runner who'd been dogging my steps for the past hour. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. I stood there for several minutes, my whole body shaking. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I'd seen. Someone had been following me, I was sure of it. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I bolted down the other side of the hill, not stopping until I reached the brightly lit street at the edge of the park. I've never been so relieved to see other people and cars. I'm writing this the next morning, and I still feel shaken. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering who it was and what they wanted. Was it just a creep getting their kicks from scaring someone, or something more sinister? I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't made it to that hilltop. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. Said there hadn't been any other incidents reported in the park. They told me to be more careful running alone at night. As if I didn't know that already. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe running in that park again, especially after dark. The rational part of my brain says it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But another part of me can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. Has anyone else experienced anything like this? I could use some advice on how to feel safe again. I love running and I don't want to give it up, but now every shadow on the street makes my heart race. I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that silent figure behind me. I'm considering getting some self-defense classes or maybe a running buddy, anything to feel less vulnerable. For now, I'm sticking to busy, well-lit areas for my runs. No more secluded park trails, that's for sure. The scariest part is not knowing. Not knowing who it was, what they wanted, or if they're still out there. Every time I think about stepping outside for a run, I picture that dark figure behind me. Will they be back? Are they watching me even now? I've always felt safe in my neighborhood, but now every little noise at night makes me jump. I've started double-checking that all my doors and windows are locked before bed. I know it's probably an overreaction, but I can't help it. That hour in the park felt like being prey, like being hunted. It's not a feeling I ever want to experience again. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't made it to that hilltop. Would they have caught up to me? What were their intentions? The possibilities my mind conjures up are terrifying. Part of me wants to go back to the park in daylight, to see if I can make sense of what happened. But another part of me never wants to set foot in there again. It's like the whole place has been tainted by fear now. I'm writing this partly to get it off my chest, and partly in hopes that someone out there might have some insight or similar experiences to share. How do you move past something like this? How do you stop jumping at every shadow? For now, I'm trying to focus on the fact that I'm safe. Whatever happened, or almost happened, I made it out okay, but I can't shake the feeling that I was seconds away from a very different outcome. The memory of those footsteps behind me, always keeping pace, will haunt me for a long time to come. If you're a runner, especially one who runs alone or at night, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. I used to think I was being overly cautious, always aware of my surroundings. Now I know that caution might have saved my life. I don't know if I'll ever get answers about what really happened that night in the park. Maybe it's better not knowing. All I know is that my evening runs will never be the same again. The peace and solitude I used to find on those quiet trails has been replaced by a constant nagging fear. I'm trying to stay positive, to not let this experience control my life. But every time I lace up my running shoes, I hesitate. Every time I step outside after dark, I scan the shadows. And every time I hear footsteps behind me, my heart races. I hope in time these feelings will fade, that I'll be able to enjoy running again without constantly looking over my shoulder. But for now, the memory of that silent, persistent figure following me through the darkening park is all too fresh. It's a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear as children can take on very real, very human forms in the adult world. To anyone reading this, stay safe out there. And if you ever feel like you're being followed, trust that feeling. Don't second-guess yourself like I did. It's better to be overly cautious than to ignore your instincts and end up in real danger. I'm still processing what happened, still trying to make sense of it all. But one thing's for certain. I'll never take my safety for granted again. That night in the park changed everything, and while I hope to never experience anything like it again, I know I'll carry the lessons learned with me always. Around 9 p.m., there was a loud knock at the door that made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late on such a miserable night. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there, just the dim glow of the porch light illuminating the sheets of rain. I opened the door, ready to duck back inside quickly to avoid getting soaked. That's when I saw it, a plain brown package sitting on the welcome mat. No shipping label, no return address, nothing to indicate where it came from or who sent it. Just my name scrawled across the top in messy handwriting. A chill ran down my spine as I picked up the package. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. I brought it inside, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this some kind of prank, a mistake, or something more sinister? With trembling hands, I carefully opened the package. Inside was a bizarre assortment of items. A worn teddy bear missing an eye, a set of old brass keys, a tattered leather-bound notebook, and an antique pocket watch frozen at 3:17. My confusion deepened as I examined each object. The bear looked like it had been well loved by a child many years ago. The keys were rusty and didn't seem to match any modern locks. The notebook was filled with indecipherable scribbles, and no matter how much I wound it, the watch refused to start ticking. At the bottom of the box was a small white card. My blood ran cold as I read the 3 words written in the same messy scrawl as the package. "We are watching." I dropped the card like it had burned me. My heart was pounding as I looked around my apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. Were there hidden cameras? Was someone outside right now, peering in through the windows? I rushed to close all the curtains, double-checking that the door was locked. But it did little to ease my rising panic. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every creak of the old building made me flinch. As the night wore on, my anxiety only grew. I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept obsessively examining the strange objects, desperately searching for some hint of their meaning or origin. But the more I looked, the less sense they made. Why these specific items? What possible connection could they have? And who was watching me? Around midnight, my nerves were so frayed that I nearly screamed when my phone chimed with a text. It was just my friend Amy checking in. I started to type out a reply, then hesitated. What if someone had hacked my phone? What if they were monitoring my communications? Paranoid thoughts raced through my mind. I ended up turning my phone off completely, not wanting to risk it. But the silence only made things worse. Now every little noise from outside seemed amplified. Was that a footstep on the stairs? The sound of someone picking the lock? My imagination conjured terrifying scenarios of masked intruders lying in wait. By 2 a.m., I was huddled in the corner of my bedroom, jumping at every sound. The rain had intensified, lashing against the windows. A flickering streetlight cast eerie moving shadows across the walls. I clutched the teddy bear from the package, finding some small comfort in its soft fur. But then I imagined a hidden microphone or camera inside it and tossed it away with a yelp. Exhausted but too afraid to sleep, I paced restlessly. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in. I considered calling the police, but what would I even tell them? I had no proof of any actual threat. As 3 a.m. approached, a fresh wave of terror washed over me. The watch in the package had been stopped at 3:17. Was something going to happen then? At 3:15 I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the front door. My breath caught in my throat as I stared wide-eyed at the hallway. The scratching continued, growing more insistent. Trembling, I crept towards the door. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then 3 loud, deliberate knocks made me stumble backwards with a strangled cry. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I inched closer again, heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. With a trembling hand, I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, I heard rapidly retreating footsteps. By the time I worked up the courage to open the door, the hallway was empty. I slammed the door shut and slid down against it, my legs too weak to hold me up any longer. Tears of fear and confusion streamed down my face as I sat there shaking. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paralyzing terror. Every noise, every shadow had me on edge. I didn't dare move from my spot by the door. As the first rays of dawn finally began to lighten the sky, my racing thoughts slowly calmed. In the light of day, it all seemed so absurd. Surely there was a logical explanation for everything. But then my eyes fell on the package and its bizarre contents. The sense of being watched returned full force. Whoever had sent this clearly knew where I lived. They could come back at any time. It's been 3 days now. I haven't left my apartment. I barely sleep. I jump every time the floor creaks or a car drives by outside. I've gone over every detail 1,000 times, but I'm no closer to understanding what's happening. Why me? What do they want? All I know is that I don't feel safe anymore. Not in my home, not anywhere. The feeling of unseen eyes on me is constant. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. I don't know how much longer I can take this psychological torment. The uncertainty is eating away at my sanity. Part of me wishes they would just reveal themselves, do whatever it is they're planning. At least then, this agonizing wait would be over. But a deeper fear keeps me paralyzed. The fear that this is all there is, that I'll spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows, never knowing if the threat is real or imagined, always watching, always waiting, with no end in sight. I'm trapped in a waking nightmare, and I have no idea how to escape.